Here's 13 things the One Piece anime got wrong. And when I say wrong, I mean mistakes. Big mistakes. And we're going to start with a very recent mistake which blows my mind. As you may or may not know, a lot of One Piece is on Netflix now, which is good and everything, except for when it isn't. Like this case, where at the end of the Paramount War, Trafalgar Law appears to save Luffy, and the Netflix subtitles introduce him as Trafalgar D. Water Law. A good 200 episodes before anyone was meant to know that. And here goes another. In episode 59, during a filler arc featuring an obese Marine Commodore named Nelson Royale, the Straw Hats find themselves trapped by Marine ships, all connected by these like super strong steel chain things. Bad situation because this was pre-Thousand Sunny, meaning we can't just over them. So how do we deal with the steel? Well, Zoro volunteers, even going on to say, there's nothing I can't cut, and that's exactly what he does. He cuts the steel chains and it's not a problem. And that's a problem, because at the pointy end of the Alabasta arc, Zoro faces off against Mr. One, a man who can turn his entire body into an assortment of steel shapes and weapons. And the whole point of this fight is to put Zoro in a situation where he has to push himself to overcome something we previously thought was impossible, at least in the manga. And anime watchers will probably be a bit confused and not really understand what the big deal is because they've already seen Zoro slice through steel like a hot knife in butter. Even though it's a pretty major mistake, I do have to give the anime some credit here because this filler episode aired in February 2001, and Zoro's fight with Mr. One would only happen in July, August of the manga later that year. So there's no way they could have known that such a small act would have had such a huge impact on Zoro's character. I mean, at this point, Zoro has been slicing stuff like bullets and cannonballs in the manga, so a steel chain wasn't the biggest stretch in the world, but then Eiichiro Oda said lol no and has made the Toei anime look like fools. And it's far from the only time. In that very same filler arc, the Straw Hats meet a dragon named Ryu meaning dragon. So the Straw Hats meet a dragon named Dragon. And he was a nice guy, dead now unfortunately, but fortunately has since reincarnated. And either way, he leaves a truly interesting legacy that we wouldn't truly understand until Punk Hazard. Pretty much the very first thing the crew discover on Punk Hazard is a dragon, and his name is also Dragon number 13. And this wouldn't be such a big deal if Luffy and Zoro didn't make such a big deal about it, with Luffy saying, "Huh, do those actually exist?" And Zoro replying with, "No, I thought they were imaginary. They can't be real." Which, in the anime continuity, makes no sense. Because one of the very first things the crew saw on their adventure was a dragon. In fact, the crew encountered a dragon before they even got into the Grand Line. So according to the anime, dragons are so mundane that you can even stumble upon them in East Blue, the most peaceful of all of the seas. And Poneglyphs are also surprisingly much more common in the anime than you may think. In episode 102, Luffy, Zoro, and Chopper get lost during some Alabasta filler material, during which they fall down a big ol' hole, and the first thing they find is, gasp, a poneglyph. And this is big stuff, because this is the first time that a poneglyph has ever been seen in the One Piece anime. This is their introduction. They even have Zoro linger on it for a second to give you that sense of narrative importance, before they promptly abandon it. But we now know that there are only 30 poneglyphs scattered throughout the world, each of which contains integral information to uncovering the lost history of the planet. So it was a very bold maneuver for the anime to create a 31st filler poneglyph, and it resulted in a lot of anime-only watchers being absolutely determined that we will go back to Alabasta, because we have to. There's another poneglyph there that Robin hasn't read yet. But this poneglyph doesn't actually exist. It was something inserted by the Toei filler team to foreshadow the eventual poneglyph reveal without knowing how important each and every single stone is. Now, you might be starting to see a bit of a pattern here. It's a very simple pattern. What happens is, whenever the One Piece anime makes some filler content, they end up doing something that wildly contradicts the manga down the road. And these days, sometimes it's even done on purpose. Like the director of One Piece film Red coming out and saying that there are some deliberate fake fighting styles amongst the red hair pirates in that movie, so as not to spoil what they do in the actual story, which is fine. But on other occasions, this is definitely not the case. And on these such occasions, the anime team unfortunately do what I lovingly refer to as shitting in the milk. Such as during Wano, when Basil Hawkins revealed that the chances of a certain man living until morning were 1%. Now, I don't know what possessed the anime to do the thing it is they did next, because when this moment was adapted, they removed all vagueness and had Hawkins blatantly state that the man he was talking about was Diaz Drake, only to be ultimately contradicted by the manga when Hawkins later reveals that the answer was himself. It's just creating unnecessary problems. The author author kept the answer to this mystery vague for a reason, and what the anime did was essentially canon theory crafting. They, to be fair, like the rest of us at the time, assumed that the man was Drake, but why take that next step and put it into the actual show? You'd think that they must have consulted with Oda before doing that, and maybe they did, and maybe it's actually Oda's fault. Maybe he changed his mind and that stitched them up. But that's all the more reason just to keep it vague and not do this in the first place. But we can't always blame the anime for their errors, such as in the Diary of Kobe Meppo, which is still one of my favorite cover stories to date, and also one of the very, very few that were lucky enough to be animated. However, cover stories are a very different beast. Rather than having the fully laid out storyboard of the regular manga, animating cover stories requires a lot more creative thinking to tell the audience how characters are getting from moment A to moment B, which opens the anime up to compromise. And in this case, we feast our eyes upon episode 69, the sex number episode, where Kobe and Helmeppo are taken into the Grand Line. We didn't see this happen in the manga, which means neither did the anime stuff. So to bridge the gap, what we see is a newspaper featuring a photo of Kobe and Helmeppo entering the Grand Line via Reverse Mountain, which is a mistake, because we know that the Marines would never do that. Reverse Mountain, that is way too dangerous, especially when they have a much easier and more direct choice. Marines make their way around the world by sailing through the calm belts, because they have these special sea stone line ships that can cross the calm belts without activating the Sea Kings. But in the anime's defense, they didn't know that at the time. The only way that the anime staff had ever seen someone get into the Grand Line was via Reverse Mountain. So it's fair to think that you would assume that's how everyone else did it as well. So yeah, I think it was a reasonable assumption to make, but a retrospective mistake nonetheless. And Kobe's instructor Garp is hardly mistake-free either. So this one's pretty subtle, and I wouldn't blame you for not noticing it or not caring about it if you did. However, it does make you ask how the people animating it didn't notice and or care. In chapter 957, good old Sengoku dumps some lore on us, introducing the concept of God Valley and the Rocks Pirates. And within this big old dump, we have a short mental flashback featuring Gold D, Roger, and Garp, the hero, joining forces to defeat said Rocks Pirates. You can see Roger here wielding his mighty sword, and Garp to his right wielding his mighty fistsome fist. Because that's the thing about Garp, if you know nothing else about him, you know that he's known for fisting people. In fact, one of his epithets is Garp the Fist, which is why it's very puzzling when this moment comes around in the anime and we have Sengoku, telling his lovely story. You see the Rocks Pirates and Roger, they all look perfect, no notes. But to the right of Roger, we have Garp the Fist wielding not that. He's holding a sword. And I'll admit that this is an error so small that it does deserve to be called a nitpick, but mate, I am going to pick the crap out of this nit because it's hard to see it happening by accident. Even if you forget that the character is literally called Garp the Fist, you've got the manga panel to work off, where he's very clearly making a punching pose. And I know sometimes the detail in the manga is so vague that I really don't envy the anime staff for needing to make sense of it, but this is not one of those occasions. And it just makes you ask why. Is it because the storyboard was done by someone who wasn't familiar with Garp, and everyone else was holding a sword, so I don't know, why not give him one? Or was this a more artistic decision? They drew Garp with the fist, and then in the framing, oh look, the fist, it doesn't look amazing, so we go with the sword. Nicer shape. Either way, it's the little things like this that break the immersion of the anime for me, and make me very hyper aware that what I'm watching is a production rather than a story. And again, that seems pretty overly dramatic for what is essentially a pretty unimpactful change. It really doesn't change anything. But I want to reinforce that what I do for a living is make videos about fictional pirates. Nothing I say matters. So let me have this one. As well as the next one, in chapter 723, the Straw Hats decide what to do with the charred, fulsome body of Jola, who they have recently defeated, and Nami comments that it would be cruel to jump Jola overboard, which Chopper agrees with because she's a devil fruit user and that would be a terrible way to die. Then Brook says that he has no desire to see her panties, but wait a minute, hang on. Don't let all that panty talk distract you from what Nami just said. She said that it would be cruel to dump a devil fruit user into the sea, and you know what, Nami? I agree. Kind of like that time that you pushed Eric the Whirlwind into the sea during episode 61, He was a devil fruit user and you quite gleefully ended his life there, something that we've investigated in Fictional Pirate Court in the 8 times the Straw Hats have killed people video, which I highly recommend you check out. But all this Eric stuff, it was anime only, and Nami, she's not always a nice person, but this gleeful murder is something that the anime definitely got wrong about her. And it's not just character quirks either, sometimes the anime gets general life facts wrong. To illustrate, whilst fleeing from Big Mom in chapter 875, Jinbei is able to stun Prometheus by firing water spears at him. And Luffy is very surprised that this works because Luffy doesn't understand anything. But Jinbei essentially replies with, "Lol, yeah, of course it works. works. Prometheus is just a big piece of talking fire, mate. Of course, his weakness is water. And I want it known that Jinbei isn't pulling his punches here. He's doing the very polite Shark Daddy version of, yeah, no shit. So just imagine Jinbei's surprise when in episode 1027, Prometheus decides to go for a swim. In the anime, when Big Mom falls off Onigashima, she actually falls straight into the ocean, which, as we've just discussed with the Eric situation, is a bad thing if you're a devil fruit user. And I think the anime staff really should have thought about this one just a little bit better, because Prometheus was the only functional homie available to rescue Big Mom, because Napoleon, well, he's always pretty useless in these sorts of situations. So it had to be Prometheus to dive into the ocean, because the anime had to put Big Mom into the ocean. No, wait, they didn't. They didn't have to do that, but they did. And this wouldn't be such a big issue if it hadn't already been established in the manga that Prometheus was extraordinarily weak to even the mere suggestion of moisture. If this had actually happened, Prometheus should have been extinguished, and in the manga we never see Big Mom fall into the water, so it's implied that Prometheus caught her before that point. And then he asked for a cloud girlfriend, but everyone got defeated before they got to have their cloud babies. That's all reasonable. But I really don't know what the anime staff were thinking here. And this isn't one of my weird nitpicks that, the anime has contradicted something from manga panel, that one from thousands and thousands of chapters ago that doesn't matter. This is just fictional physics. Prometheus is fire and water is water. It's not ending well. And again, the craziest thing is that the anime didn't even need to do this. They made the decision to plonk Big Mom into the ocean for the sake of drama and wrote themselves into a weird situation as a result. The word result sounding a bit like salt, and you'll see why that's a terrible transition in a bit. Because before the end of the Water 7 saga, One Piece became something of a slice of life show for a few weeks, focusing on some more mundane everyday storylines, such as the episode titled Mothers Are Strong, Zoro's hectic household chores, which saw him put on a tight top that said mama and struggle with the daily tasks of being a parent. That was quite fun. And Sanji, of course, also gets a whole episode of his own which focused on salt. Yummy, yummy salt. Sanji discovers a delicious special salt on the Water 7 rooftops, which was delivered by Aqua Laguna, and heavily implied to have originated from the All Blue. Now this one hasn't been contradicted in the manga yet, but look, I can just feel it. Whenever the All Blue is revealed, it's going to be a nightmare to explain how Aqua Laguna traveled from all of the way there to Water 7. So I'm putting this one in the video preemptively. Now for a particularly picky one. In episode 196, G8 Vice Admiral Jonathan is playing a game of chess with himself, and in a rather bold maneuver, he moves the White King into a triple check, with the Knight, Pawn, and Black Queen all soundly guarding it. This is, of course, an illegal move. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter because it's all metaphorical wankery. It's supposed to represent the Straw Hats coming to the G8 base, where they are theoretically completely surrounded by Marines and therefore checkmate. But the wankery isn't the problem. The problem is this Black Queen, who in the very next shot becomes a White Queen. And that is not only illegal in chess, but also illegal in the general laws of reality, even in fictional pirate reality. And just to really rub it in, they also give us another close-up of the Queen as well. But animation errors are definitely some of my favorite things about the One Piece anime. They're absolutely meaningless, but they gift us a lot of fun. For example, I'm a particularly big fan of three-legged Marguerite, because it takes a bit to notice what's happening here, but that is definitely three legs, or a very popular fan theory, that Marguerite is just a well-equipped man undercover on the island of women. Then there's also the classic two-armed Shanks, and the similarly classic two Zoros in one shot. Oh, and also in episode 226, we are subjected to a six-toed Nami. And wouldn't you know it, that last animation error was picked up by far the quickest, because you can always trust the internet to put a weird focus on feet. But look, in the end, everything in this video is a pretty minor gripe. A lot of it's more funny contradictions that don't really have an impact in the grand scheme of things, except for this one. There is one time where the anime got something so wrong that it changed the message of an entire arc. Arguably the worst mistake the anime has made comes from episode 536, where we get an anime-only flashback for Hody Jones. And in this flashback, we see a group of human pirates having traveled to Fishman Island to catch some slaves to sell on the surface. And they end up capturing Hody's friend Dosen. Oh no, Dosen. So Hody and the rest of the squad, children as they are, jump into combat. But as I just said, they're children, and so they get beaten up by all the humans. The humans then plan to take all of them as slaves, but the kids get saved by Arlong, and this is intended to explain why Hody idolizes Arlong and how his hatred for humans was seeded. And that seems pretty reasonable as a surface level idea. Humans did do that to Fishman, so it seems reasonable until you remember that it ruins everything that Hody Jones is meant to represent. The big revelation during the climax of Fishman Island is that when Prince Fukaboshi asks Hody what humans have ever done to him, Hody replies with the absolutely absolutely chilling one-word answer, nothing. The point is that Hody is a phantom of the hatred of the past. He's the embodiment of what Fisher Tiger was afraid of passing on to the next generation. And that's why Fisher Tiger's last words were begging his crew not to tell people how he died. Because someone like Hody would go on to inherit the mantle of hatred and continue the cycle. Even though he'd never experienced any persecution himself, that doesn't matter. What Hody is meant to represent is blind hatred. But in the anime, he experienced it. Humans literally tried to enslave him as a child. So this isn't just a lol wrong chess piece color kind of error. Whoever wrote this anime-only scene had a fundamental misunderstanding of Hody as a character. And the anime isn't even consistent with itself, because when the big climax does come around, Hody says the exact same thing that he did in the manga, that humans have never done anything to him. They did, and we saw it, and it ruins everything. But you let me know in the comments if there are any anime mistakes I missed, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. Is it time for One Piece to stop doing this? There is one thing in this story, you might not be consciously aware of it, but it's the secret ingredient for almost every arc in the series, and a key reason why One Piece is so gripping, satisfying, and honestly a little bit addictive. And it's very simple. It's a countdown. A device used in almost every arc when Oda says something like, there's X minutes until Y outcome. And on Egghead Island, we've been given our most recent countdown, which has resulted in the following reaction.
This trope has happened time and time again, and I don't know why people are still defending it. I don't understand why so many One Piece fans are just so blinded and just want to be like, nope, everything is good. Oda's writing the best story ever. There's no problems. Everything's fine. Everything's okay. Everything's amazing. It's not. Like, can we just acknowledge it so then we can get actual good chapters moving on? I feel like the One Piece fandom as a whole, it just sucks right now. I really don't enjoy interacting with it.
Now, to be fair, I think there's a bit more behind this reaction than just the time limit. But again, to continue being fair, he's not the only one who reacted like this. Let's face it, the time limit is a well-worn trope. Whether we have 6 days before the execution of Podcast Ace, 1 hour before the birdcage closes on Dressrosa, 30 minutes until the Buster Call arrives in Isobe, or 5 minutes until Onigashima destroys the flower capital. No matter what it is, we have seen Oda employ the countdown trope over and over and over and over again. And we will see him continue to employ it for every major arc until One Piece ends. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I would actually argue that if you took this one simple device away from One Piece, then the series would suffer irrevocable damage as a result. There's a reason why Oda keeps doing this, and it's not lazy writing. In fact, it's very much the opposite. It's about maximizing the impact of his writing with everything he can. So to really get into this, we have to begin with the idea that clocks don't operate in a vacuum, which is a strange sentence to say. On their own though, countdowns are meaningless. And the countdown only forms one layer in our delicious fictional pirate lasagna, layer 4 to be precise. These are Eiichiro Oda's 5 layers of tension in One Piece. This is the secret, but also not so secret if you're paying attention formula, that has elevated One Piece from all of its shonen contemporaries across multiple generations now. Every modern One Piece arc has these 5 elements that work together to create an exceptional sense of tension, with the first layer of tension being immediate danger to our main characters. This is obviously extremely basic and common to all battle manga, and it's created when our protagonists directly face danger. It should be noted that One Piece has almost no arcs that involve just this singular layer alone. Although one example I can think of is Long Ring Longland, because that was a completely isolated incident of the Straw Hat Pirates versus the Foxy Pirates. And with that in mind, it's probably fair to say that Long Ring Longland is the One Piece arc with by far the least amount of tension. The second layer of tension is immediate danger to innocent people that the crew have met. In this case, the crew are no longer just fighting for themselves, and what we have is a character, or characters plural, who often form the emotional core. A basic example would be the fight with Alvida during Romance Dawn. There, our second layer of tension was the fact that we needed to save Kobe, and Oda very often uses children in this role, with other examples being Tama and Toko. Children are great because they're just such an easy way to trigger the protective mechanisms in humans. Children are of course also very thematically important in One Piece. It's a series about generational shift, and children represent the dreams of the future. But Oda does switch it up a bit. Like say on Little Garden, when we had the exact opposite of children, there the second layer of tension was fighting for Dory and Brocky, 2 super strong giant men who had lived for over a century. Meanwhile, the third layer of tension is the immediate danger to the environment around our main characters, also known as the Doomsday Device. This threatens not just our main characters and not just our second layer characters, but everyone within the zone zone in which the arc is taking place. And almost every post-time skip arc in One Piece features the Doomsday device, but they were also quite prominent pre-time skip as well, such as the bomb on Alabasta, Enel's Arc Maxim on Skypiea, the Buster Call, and etc. And the reason why this layer keeps working so well for One Piece is because it acts as a multiplier effect on the second layer of tension. It's like saying, you know this one character that we're fighting for? Well, now that we have this Doomsday scenario, we've got thousands of that character who are going to die if we don't stop it. And obviously the Doomsday device also allows Oda to create these brilliant spectacle pieces. Some of the most iconic imagery in One Piece comes from these, like the bird cage slowly closing in on Dressrosa, or that terrifying image of the gas spreading throughout Punk Hazard, or even Noah threatening to crush Fishman Island, stuff like that. And now we arrive at the subject of this video, which is the fourth layer of tension, the countdown to Doomsday, where what we do is place a time limit on the execution of that third layer. The countdown doesn't add a new form of danger in and of itself, but it amplifies the existing danger by telling us exactly when it's going to happen. For example, if I told you that you were going to die, you'd probably shrug that off and say, yeah, eventually, it's what we all do. But if I were to tell you that you have an hour left to live, then you're probably going to have a much more intense reaction. Time pressure in general is a universal feeling. On some level, we all understand the intensity that this can add to any sector of your life, no matter how mundane. Like if you have a job interview one morning but miss your alarm. So you wake up and you've got 20 minutes to do what would normally take you an hour, and even though it isn't anything particularly difficult, you still feel that pressure. So just being aware of time is a whole separate layer of tension in and of itself. But there's also more to it than that. Above all else, the countdown is about asserting control. Whoever the main villain of an arc just so happens to be isn't simply threatening our main characters, our side characters, or their home. The villain is threatening their time sovereignty. At every step of the way, the antagonist is in control, and setting these time limits makes them seem so much more threatening and so much more competent. The fact that Doflamingo created the birdcage is one thing, but the fact that he set a time limit of 1 hour until its complete closure is another, because he is now controlling both your freedom and your time. Now, there is also a fifth layer of tension in One Piece being legacy, the idea that if we don't do the thing, then we will have failed the inherited will of someone who died to put us in this position. For example, on Fishman Island, if we don't stop Hody Jones, then we lose everything that both Otohime and Fisher Tiger worked, suffered, and were martyred for. That's a particularly fun layer because you don't necessarily see it in a lot of stories. And I don't know why, because it's another very easy thing that just amplifies them. But those are the 5 layers of Eiichiro Oda's story lasagna. Though I think the metaphor would work a little bit better if legacy was the first layer because it's underneath everything. But here's an arc-specific example of how the layering works. During Wano, the first layer of tension is obviously the Straw Hats. They're on a hostile island and we ideally want them to survive. Great. Then our second layer would be our close Wano allies, Kinemon, Momonosuke, and all of the rest. There's a lot in this arc, including Toko and Tama, of course. But it's that group of characters that forms the emotional core of Wano. The third layer of tension is that this nasty fish dragon, Kaido, is going to drop a big ol' island on the flower capital, which is going to kill thousands of Kinemons, Tamas, and Tokos. Then we have the fourth layer being that we have exactly 15 minutes to stop Kaido, his crew, and all of the other problems before Onigashima reaches the flower capital. And finally, we have the fifth layer, which is that if we fail, then we waste the legacy of Kozuki Oden, Toki, and Yasu, the figures who gave their lives to put us in this position. And when you think about all 5 layers, the fourth one is by far the easiest to achieve. You don't need to worry about creating compelling characters, drama, action spectacles, or hard-hitting flashbacks. All you need to do is say, and all of this stuff is gonna happen in this amount of minutes. Setting a clock is probably one of the most overpowered devices in all of storytelling because it takes very little creativity and basic logistical ability to keep track of everything. But the dividend it pays for that tiny investment is tremendous. With that said, you do still need to do it correctly. The fact that it's an easy device to use doesn't mean that authors will always employ it well. And also, it's not quite as simplistic as I've made it sound. So to illustrate in One Piece, Eiichiro Oda actually has 2 types of clocks that he uses across arcs. The first is the very funny sounding hard clock, funny because it sounds like I'm referring to a penis, but this is where Oda puts an exact time limit on an event occurring. We've talked a lot about these already, so I'm not going to go into every instance in One Piece where one of these has been used, but for a couple we haven't spoken about. On Skypiea, from the very beginning, Enel's survival game is given a time limit of 3 hours. We don't know what's going to happen after that 3 hours is up, and it's not good, and Enel gives us periodic updates of exactly where the time stands right down to the final minutes. And another great example is on Thriller Bark, where after having their shadow stolen, the Straw Hats have until dawn to defeat Gecko Moria, and get them back, which is also probably the closest call in all of One Piece, given that Zoro, Sanji, Robin, and Luffy all literally lose their heads right before getting their shadows back. Should also note that Thriller Bark has a sub countdown as well, where Luffy is given access to his nightmare form but is warned that he will only have 10 minutes to use it, so he has a very short time to get the job done. And I'd also like to point out that the entire Paramount War saga has a hard clock applied to it, as Amazon, Lily, Impel Down, and Marineford are all framed by the countdown to the execution of Ace. And I think that the final saga might have a similar framing device as well, a much grander countdown to some sort of unspeakably bad event that spans a few arcs. But along with your classic examples of Alabaster, Enislobby, Dressrosa, Wano, do you get the idea? Oda loves to set a hard clock. And the fact that almost every major saga conflict ends with a countdown is definitely something that Oda has used to the point of being a very predictable trope in his writing. But time doesn't always have to be restricted so clinically, because Oda also frequently makes use of soft clocks, which are designed to give a more vague idea of time, where we know that something bad is going to happen, and look, we know it's going to happen soon, but we don't have an exact measure. Oftentimes we need to pick up on environmental clues. Like on Fishman Island, we don't have a countdown, but we sure as crap do see how close Noah is continuously getting to the island. Or for a more subdued example, we can also look at Little Garden. During this arc, Zoro, Vivi, and Nami get caught in the waxed candelabra and are put on a soft clock where no time limit is ever given other than soon, but we have a sense of time passing because we can see the wax gradually covering more and more of them. And these countdowns can also get a little bit more abstract, like on Whole Cake Island, where Sanji had to bake a cake to stop Big Mom before she caught up to and killed the Straw Hats, as well as everyone else in her sight. We never had a hard time set on when that was going to happen, but the danger grew more and more palpable with every second that passed and the closer the Big Mom got to the Sunny. Although there was also a hard clock element, where Luffy had to beat Katakuri and meet up with the Straw Hats by a certain time. But often in the post-time skip era, Oda mixes both hard and soft clocks together, and Punk Hazard would be a great example of that. The third layer of tension here was the Shinokuni gas, which was gradually infiltrating each Punk Hazard building, and we got frequent visual updates of how far the gas had spread, along with some time-specific updates, like when Building B was given a 20-minute clock. There are very, very few arcs in One Piece that do not involve Oda's time pressure device. Some notable exceptions are most of the East Blue Saga because, well, Oda had yet to invent the device, as well as non-typical transition arcs like Return to Sabadi, Jaya, Zo, or The Reverie. And again, I'd also throw Long Ring Longland in there as well. That was a very non-typical arc because that's when One Piece turned into a gag manga for one volume, so there's no real need to add time pressure. And in fact, Oda actively took away time pressure by giving the antagonist a devil fruit with the ability to slow time down, which I think is such a perfect illustration of tension and intensity. Whenever Oda wants to get down to some very serious business, he puts 10 minutes on the clock and makes all of his characters fight against it. But whenever he wants to screw around and have fun, he finds a way to give them even more time than should be scientifically possible, which now finally brings us back to Egghead Island. Currently, we have been given yet another clock. This time it's a 10-minute wait until Vegapunk reveals the various truths of the world, which was met with a little bit of online backlash as we've explored. But I find that really weird. In all of my time as a One Piece fan, which because I'm old is a lot, this is the first time I've heard complaints about the countdown system. And they've come at the weirdest possible time because Egghead Island is a complete subversion of the trope. In this case, instead of putting pressure on the protagonist, the clock is now working against the antagonist. And remember what I said about control. On Egghead Island, the antagonists are not in control because we, the protagonists, have set the clock. What we've done in this situation is take time sovereignty away from the world government. We have ripped the Five Elders down from their position at Marijois and forced them into engaging on our terms. It's a really fun reversal of the trope. They have 10 minutes to stop us or else they lose everything. And it also gives us a win condition without having to defeat the Five Elders right here and now. Because at the end of every other clock, we have a defeated antagonist, either unconscious, on the floor, or bathing in magma, or whatever they prefer. But with Egghead Island, Oda is potentially taking the opportunity to break with his traditional formula and give us a way of winning without having to go through all of the standard beats of physically beating the bad guys. So we're using the same device in a new way, which I personally find very exciting. However, someone did reply to me on Twitter with a very interesting comment about this. Throwing a new coat of paint onto my wall doesn't make it not the same wall. It could make it look new and fresh, but it's really just the same wall. And I honestly think that this comment could not have summed up things any better. I actually agree with him. So I replied, so are you suggesting that we find an alternative to walls, or is there a very good reason why we still use them? I don't know about you guys, but I am a big fan of my walls. And stories have walls too, because they're still structures, just non-physical structures, and each author has their preferred building style. And when it comes to Oda, time consciousness is one of his walls. If you remove that wall, then One Piece, look, it still works. The structure isn't going to completely fall, it just doesn't work as well. It won't be anywhere near as strong. So for example, let's see what happens if you remove the clock. Let's take any Sobby. Spandam accidentally uses the golden Den Mushi because he's a bit of a prick and summons a boss to call. But in this case, the audience are not going to be told that the ships will be here in 30 minutes. So as an audience, immediately, we no longer have as powerful of a sense of impending doom because we don't know how long we have. It could take minutes, hours, maybe even a day. There's no hard clock to tell us. And there's also no soft clock that we can keep visual track of because it's one of two things. The ships are either here or they're not. It's only through knowing that we have exactly 30 minutes till doomsday that it makes it feel like every action taken by the crew counts. Victories feel more earned and mistakes feel infinitely more costly. Like Usopp and Zoro accidentally getting handcuffed together. That's bad enough on its own. But the fact that they've done this with less than half an hour to solve this new problem before solving their existing problem just continues to stack tension upon tension. And I'd also argue that this is why One Piece works very well to both binge and read weekly. Because even though you could be reading the events of 15 minutes over the course of half a year, every chapter, every week, still comes with that time awareness, that desperation, and that added layer of drama. Whereas a lot of other shonen series don't make use of this device and can really start to feel drawn out and exhausting because it feels like it's taking these characters hours, days, weeks, or even months to accomplish what should be a not that long of a task. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen in One Piece as well. There's always points during these countdowns where you're like, so Onigashima was supposed to fall in 15 minutes, but that was 6 months ago. But I would much prefer that to the alternative where we have no time awareness at all. So look, I get where Roger's base was coming from. The countdown is something that Oda uses again and again and again, and it is something that he's going to keep using again and again and again. Same way I keep using the words again and again and again. But I'm okay with that because the countdown works. And I think that the core structure of One Piece arcs would feel pretty lacking without it. Just as your core viewing of One Piece material on YouTube would feel pretty lacking without subscribing to this channel, which would grant you consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. These are the top 10 most hated characters in One Piece, as voted by over 7,000 members of the Grand Fleet. And look, this isn't your average fictional pirate poll either, because I conducted a pre-poll to ascertain the most hated characters in the series. I then took the top 15 responses and threw them into a ranked choice voting poll, which means that all of the pollees were asked to rank their most hated characters in order from most to least hated, with the 10th most hated character in One Piece being deemed as Scratchman Apu. And really, look, the dude has poo in his name, so I feel like he was always destined for this level of infamy. Scratchman Apu is that he's a love him or hate him kind of character, and people are generally more on the hating him side, because he's relentlessly loud, grating, obnoxious, weird, and just has questionable taste in music. Now, for people who enjoy the idea of musically fiddling with their bodily instruments, then yes, Apu is a strong candidate for favorite character, but in my experience, for a lot of the fanbase, he doesn't land particularly well. He's also a filthy, filthy traitor, so that's a problem. Although personally, I wouldn't say I hate him. He's definitely much more annoying in the anime though, because I can actually hear him. And at least when reading the manga, my imagination can tone him down a bit and substitute his music for something that I enjoy a bit more. But Scratchman Apu had an incredibly even distribution across rank choice, and in his defense, he never got super high points in any individual section. Only 3.18% of all voters put him as their number one most hated, which is only 235 people. However, the passion of those 235 people cannot be underestimated. I cannot overstate my appreciation of Scratchman Apu's inclusion on this list of most hate characters. Thanks for reminding me of Scratchman Apu. I absolutely despise him. Number one it is. Scratchman Apu is my most hated. I always felt like he never should have existed in the first place. I don't know why Apu was even on the list, but he will remain at number one because I am just blatantly racist. That last comment there was probably written by a member of the Long Leg tribe. They and the Long Arm tribe have a millennia of bad blood between them. between them, which was recently bridged with the alliance of Blue Gilly and Ideo. However, the hate is still out there, and for whatever reason, racism included, Scratchman-Apu is the 10th most hated character in all of One Piece. But compared to what we have coming up, Scratchman-Apu doesn't even qualify as a hate entree. He's more like a very poorly constructed hate hors d'oeuvre, with the 9th most hated character pretty immediately eclipsing him because it is Absalom. I think that Absalom is a pretty easy one to despise and a rare strikeout by Oda when it comes to character creation, because he's the guy who takes the pervy quirk way over the line, like when he licked Nico Robin and forced Nami against a wall in the shower. I personally don't like Absalom because I just can't get on board with his character quirk, and that's problematic because that quirk is pretty much all there is to him. So if you don't like it, then you don't like him. Everything about Absalom in Thriller Bark either has a sexual or romantic end goal, and putting the moral issues aside, it's just kinda boring that there's nothing more to him than that. Although in Japanese, Absalom, he does have a little bit more weirdness because he often seems to refer to himself in the plural. He says lines like, "You will become our bride," which is weird because he's only referring to himself. So I don't know, there's this big mess happening with Absalom, and One Piece fans en masse want very little to do with it, with the general opinion of him being summed up as the following: Absalom for obvious reasons, which might actually make you wonder how he only ended up in 9th place, and I think the answer to that is because there are characters who are fun to hate, fun to watch get beat up, or do hateful things for an extremely relevant in-world agenda, and Absalom is none of these. And for all of these reasons, Absalom became an example of a character who was very easy to kill off, which is not easy to do in One Piece. Oda took care of Absalom off-screen, gave his devil fruit to someone else, and I think the series is probably better off without him. Although I have to say there was just a little bit of potential with Absalom, because Oda did draw an image of him as a child, where he apparently grew up as a gravedigger and had this vaguely defined dream of becoming the Graveyard King, but that just makes it all the more frustrating that this was never explored in favor of him being a sex pest. And I think the word pest also accurately describes the 8th most hated character, Charlotte Flampe, who was first introduced in chapter 891, and she became one of the most hated characters in One Piece in chapter 892 after she sabotaged the battle between Luffy and Katakuri. So let me tell you, at the time, Flampe was unquestionably the most hated character in all of, not even One Piece, just media in general. As soon as she did this, mate, weekly readers took this interruption very personally. And it really did take a couple of years for the heat around Flampe to die down. And given that she's still number 8 on this list, it looks like that oven never quite got turned off. For me, I definitely wouldn't say I hate Flampe. It's a bit difficult to hate the character responsible for giving Katakuri such a fantastic moment of stabbing himself and really taking that big step of character development, which would end in mutual respect for Luffy. Although I will say that Flampe is a bit tropey for my taste. You don't often see One Piece going into the really generic anime archetypes, but Flampe fits the obsessive little sister trope a little bit too perfectly. One interesting fact about Flampe is that she had the highest percentage of people put her in last place. So amongst this group, she is statistically the most least hated. And I think that's because Flampe is hateable for all of the right reasons. Oda engineered her to tank outrage rather than Absalom, who was engineered to be funny. So in that way, I really appreciate Flampe because she did exactly what she was supposed to do. And that even gives her some appeal to certain voters. Flampe is a bit too close to my type to hate. That type being a brat with a literal bubble butt, I suppose. Although, controversially, it did eventually come out that Flampe chooses to dress herself in a balloon. That is not her actual butt. Because there's an image of her from One Piece Treasure Cruise, and as it turns out, she's just a normal girl who chooses to embubble herself. But right above this brat in 7th place is the loathsome magma daddy that is Sakazuki. Now, Sakazuki is the first character here who actually has a genuinely strong positive fanbase. Honestly, I like Sakazuki. He's a really good character. My boy Sakazuki did nothing wrong. Ace had his freedom and he threw it away. Ace chose donut. And recently there's also been a developing movement of people who feel actively bad for Sakazuki because they see his frustration dealing with the world government, and despite his extreme views, he's definitely not on the same level of evil as the world nobles or the Five Elders, and in fact, compared to them, he's practically a protagonist. So there is a lot of appreciation for him, which means that those who do hate him have to hate him that much harder for him to have landed here. And I also feel like you can both hate and appreciate him, which I guess we'll call appreciating, and it's mainly for the following. Akainu is my most hated, not for what he did to Ace, but for what he did in Ohara. I'd like it noted that this comment is spelled Ohara with an apostrophe, thus making it sound like a very Irish island. And rest assured, this St. Patrick's Day, I will personally be pouring one out for the memory of Ohara. I think this commenter makes a great point though. I've never really disliked Sakazuki for what he did to Ace, because I've always held the belief that Ace, he very much did that to himself. Sakazuki was just doing his job. Every Marine on that island would have killed Ace because that was the whole point. He was supposed to be executed, and Sakazuki turned out to be the only one who could actually get the job done. But Ohara is a different matter. Executing a criminal for crimes, even if he's our main character's brother, is one thing, but coldly ordering a genocide on an entire civilization for the sake of justice is another. And that's why Sakazuki very much deserves his place on this list. As does our sixth most hated character, Vanderdecken. I just despise the creep that is Vanderdecken. My most hated character is Vanderdecken because I used to know someone like him. Vanderdecken goes straight to the top for me. Dude literally wanted to marry a child. So that is 100% true. 10 years ago, Vanderdecken saw a 6-year-old mermaid and decided to dedicate his whole life to marrying her, as well as attaining all of the assorted benefits that come with marriage, which aren't, all sexual. He also wanted Shirahoshi's wealth, fame, and power. And look, to be as charitable as I can be to Vanderdecken, he didn't choose Shirahoshi at random. After discovering that she had the power of Poseidon, he wanted to claim that power for himself. And it's implied that the Vanderdecken line has history with this particular ancient weapon. The truth of the legend is a secret that belongs to my family alone, I think. I don't know why he added the I think to the end there, but that's actually really interesting, because this is Vanderdecken the Ninth. So there is a long line of history with this character that we will probably sadly never dive into. So he has family issues with weapon, and his plan was actually to try and aid Shirahoshi up with the contents of the Tamate box. That is being as charitable as I can. To be as realistic as I can, he also spent 10 years declaring his genuine love for a child, calling her a real beauty at the age of 6, stated that he, quote, likes big women, and often mentally pictures her in very suggestive poses. So all in all, just under 45% of all voters had Vanderdecken in their top 5 most hated characters, and I think that's a pretty good reason. And yet, there are still 5 magnificent specimens who managed to outdo this child predator. And for our 5th most hated character, we need to go back in time. Ooh. Because 41 years ago, a great mistake was made when Spandine and his wife, who we're going to call Spandina, gave birth to their child Spandam, assumedly through Spandina's Spangina. Spandam easy. Spandam, no question. Spandam's gotta be number 1. Something interesting I noticed is that much more so than any other character, people really didn't feel a need to justify hating Spandam. With everyone else, it's like Flampe because of all of the weird shit she did, or Absalom because of all of that he did. But with Spandam, there is this innate, unspoken understanding of hatred. In fact, the most detailed comment we got was the following. Spandam. Hate him cause what he did to Robin. And he did do some horrible things to Robin. He slapped her, dragged her by the hair, slammed her face into the stone floor, and just kept physically and mentally abusing her at seemingly every moment he could, right up until Sogeking finally got rid of him. He also has the entitled brat thing going on. Spandam is of course the subject of nepotism, and he only has his position because Daddy Spandine was a big cypherpole dude guy back in the day. So he's even more hateable because there is nothing earned about his position. At least with someone like Sakazuki, he can back up his dickery with a show of power, but Spandam has absolutely nothing behind him. And that's why he has to make himself feel better by repeatedly hitting a defenseless woman. But it's not just about what he did to Robin. It's also about what he did to Tom as well. Most people remember Spandam as the guy who brutalized Robin during any slobby, but he was also the one who used the battle Frankies to attack Water 7 and ended up getting Tom arrested and executed. And it really says something when Rob Lucci, a cold-hearted mass murderer, is infinitely more liked than Spandam. I think that even if Rob Lucci had successfully killed Robin, that Spandam would probably still be more disliked within the fanbase. But probably not more disliked than our 4th place finisher, Saint J. Garcia Satin. Alright, so this might be recency bias, but I think that J. Garcia Satin might be my personal most hated character at this moment. The way he systematically tortured and dismantled Bartholomew Kuma is on a whole different level to anything anyone else on this list has ever accomplished. He experimented on Ginny, and then the way he made sure that Kuma was literally and mentally ripped apart piece by piece, it is all just Saint Satin is the closest thing we've had to the idea of pure evil, and it makes him one of the more compelling antagonists to me, because he's able to achieve so much, and I 1,000,000% loathe him, but for all of the right reasons. I am so supremely invested invested in causing him as much pain and suffering as possible, which I'm not so much in cases like Flampe and Scratchman Apu. For the most part, I just want them to go away, but not Saturn. I will not allow him to exit quietly into the night. I should say that Saturn does have a pretty decent level of respect happening here as well, because if you look at his voting stats, the curve forms a valley. So you have a lot of people at the top of the rankings who really hate him, and a lot of people at the bottom who really don't, or at least not as much as the other 14 people, and then not a whole lot happening in the middle. However, the hate at the top is so potent that it has earned Saturn 4th place. But now we are going to move on to the big 3 of hated characters in One Piece, starting with the bronze medal treble. And look, when you create a character who deliberately chooses to coat himself in snot, then I think you should be prepared for him to be one of the top 3 most hated in the series. Treble is disgusting. Treble made me take a break from One Piece. Treble without a doubt. But it may have just been the English dub that ruined him for me. So weirdly enough, Treble's voice in the English dub is almost exactly the same as it is in Japanese. In both cases, it sounds like "Nya, never, nya." But Treble has the same kind of issue as Absalom and Vanderdecken, not so much in the sexual harassment kind of way, but in the no decent payoff kind of way. All 3 of them are secondary villains in their own arc that are mostly reduced to the one annoying quirk they have. I never really remember Treble for anything he did, just that he was also there, which is not a good enough legacy to have for someone so disgusting and annoying. Unlike our silver medal winner Kurozumi Orochi, who is one of only 2 characters who got over 1,000 votes for the number 1 rank, which should tell you just how stacked our ultimate winner is, because my god, the winner got so many first place votes. But Orochi is certainly pulling his weight in the realm of hatred. I'm sure most can relate. Orochi boils my blood. It's a close battle between Akainu and Orochi, but I'll have 2-2 with Orochi. 2-2. My number 1 will always go to Orochi. No matter who else shows up, I'm always gonna hate him. Orochi is like a mega spandam, a coward who hides behind a greater power with a frankly hideous design that ends up being perfectly reflective of his hideous inner personality. He's responsible for more horrors than I have time to list, but a pretty memorable one would be feeding all of those smile fruits to an entire town and ruining all of their lives for the sake of an afternoon lol. He's also he's a vat of wasted potential. Orochi is one of the craziest devil fruits in the series, but he isn't capable of utilizing it beyond a party trick. He also shows a lot of genuine tactical and intellectual promise, but all of his ideas end up sucking. He also has a legitimately tragic past, being an innocent victim of his family's purge, but that never really goes anywhere, and he ends his run as another flat One Piece villain. Although if we're being completely honest, I think that Orochi's biggest crime is not being good looking, which I would argue is the same for most characters on this list. If Orochi had a Doflamingo-esque design, then this fanbase would be infested with Orochi simps, and I would wager the same for any other aesthetically challenged character on this list, including many of our honorable mentions, because rounding out the top 15 in this order were Foxy, Vinsmoke Judge, Stelly, Kanjuro, and Wapol, with the only redeemable design of the bunch being Kanjuro. I'm quite proud that Foxy didn't make it into the top 10 because I don't think he deserves it. I will forever remain a Foxy supremacist. But by now, I imagine that you may have guessed who the most hated character in One Piece is, and the gold medal, of course, goes to Saint Charlos, who received by far the most amount of first place votes. In fact, almost a third of everyone who participated in this poll had Saint Charlos smack bang in the number 1 most hated position. So much so that if these characters were multinational corporations, then we'd have to start lobbying to break up Charlos's monopoly on hate. But the best thing about Charlos is that he's a character who we can take out our frustrations on. As bad as he is, we've gotten to see Charlos get the crap beat out of him on 3 separate occasions now, and it is glorious each and every time. Which is why I have a bit of a soft spot for him, because I know that as awful as he is, and it's pretty awful, but all of that aside, I know that someone is imminently going to rip him a new butthole. But those are the top 10 most hated characters in all of One Piece as dictated by you, the Grand Fleet. And if you want the chance to participate in future videos, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, which also grants consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. Let's talk about our Jaguar D controversy. So first up, this video is a response to Mr. Morge's One Piece's greatest weakness video, a link to which will be in the description, but it discusses the narrative issues of Saul being alive, as well as the greater aspects of fake out deaths being a suspicious and off-putting stain on the otherwise pristine clean sheets of the One Piece hotel room bed. And I agree with a lot of what he has to say, but I disagree in one very big way. But to start with the former, in his video, Mr. Morge makes a very important distinction, and this is uses language that I would like to adopt going forward, which is the difference between a fake-out death and a false death scene. At face value, these two statements sound the same, and until I tell you how they're different, they will continue to be. But the way I would distinguish between the two of them is through the wonderful world of grammar. So if we consider the concept of a death scene as a sentence, then a fake-out death is a sentence that ends with a question mark. It leaves a lot of ambiguity as to whether or not the character actually died. My example of a fake-out death scene would be when Doflamingo confronted Bellamy on Jaya, where the last thing we see of him is Sarkis about to strike him in the back with a big old knife. It's not a sword, it is a knife, because his name is Big Knife Sarkis. Doesn't really matter though, because this is a question mark. We don't see the strike, we don't see the body, and we don't hear anyone say, oh no, Bellamy is dead. So there's a completely plausible scenario where Bellamy survives this as he went on to, and this cliffhanger serves as a great piece of tension that adds to the looming threat of Flamingo. And another example would be something along the lines of when Galila, the Frankie family, Oimo and Kashi were caught in the fire of the bus to call it any slobby. It's a solid piece of tension, but there is a clear question mark there, and in fact you almost expect them to survive. That is a fake-out death. A death scene in which you are left with a question mark. There is something remaining to be answered. But in contrast to that, I would describe a false death scene as ending a sentence with a full stop. It is designed to give you an unambiguous impression that a character has died. And when implemented well, it can be a gut-wrenching emotional experience that really makes the reader feel the power and permanency of death. After you encounter one of these scenes, you're not waiting for the reveal that, hey, everything turned out to be okay. At least not usually. In One Piece, but the idea is that there are no more questions to be asked. These scenes feel like a resolution, which can make it quite infuriating when they aren't. And Pell is always the best go-to example of this. We all know it. This was a false death scene. He sacrificed himself after indulging in a lovely flashback. His character was perfectly wrapped up, and the explosion that he made in the sky was a giant full stop, both metaphorically and very literally. So when Pell turns out to be alive, it's like you need to question your own ability to read. Because I could have sworn that I read a full stop on that page, and yet here we are continuing the sentence. And when strange men on the internet like me criticize death in One Piece, it's not that we're bloodthirsty corpse mongers who just want this series to be more serious and edgy and ever so cool. In fact, in my case, I always want a lot less edge in One Piece. Give me more of the goof. But what we want is for Eiichiro Oda to follow through on the choices that he as an author makes. And if he writes a death scene, I want to know that I can trust that. But after Alabasta, I completely lost that trust in Oda. Let's use a bit of a different example. Let's take another emotion. Instead of the sadness, grief, and permanency generated by death, let's use anger. Let's say that you're in a heated internet debate and everything your opponent says seems engineered to anger you, and boy is it working, because mate, you're furious. But then at the end of the debate, your opponent reveals that they didn't believe anything they'd said and they were just trolling you. That revelation immediately invalidates all of the time and energy that you invested into that debate, and everything that you felt, all of that anger was fabricated. That's very much what Eiichiro Oda does. He death trolls you. He baits you into feeling a certain emotion only to invalidate that feeling later. Because I bet that you feel pretty stupid when you realize that you've taken troll bait, and I felt the same way the first few times that Oda got me to take his death bait. It's at the point where these days when I see characters die in One Piece, I feel nothing, absolutely nothing, which is a particularly morbid experience on the rare occasions when characters do actually die, like Izo and Ashura Doji. But I just don't have that trust in Oda to feel any emotion in a death scene anymore, because he's abused my trust far too many times. And so when it comes to talking about the Saul situation, which I am on the record as praising quite a bit, what I do think we need to establish first is whether Saul was a fake out death scene or a false death scene. Because if it's the former, then that's fine, but if it's the latter, then we have another problem to add to the problem pile. And one thing I should note right here and now is that Saul's death has been a topic of controversy ever since it allegedly played out back in 2006. And this can be seen best on the One Piece wiki, specifically in the talk section of Jaguar D Saul's page, which up until Egghead Island had an ongoing feud about whether or not to place Saul in the dead category. In 2006, a wiki editor named Justin decided to open a civil discussion about the potential of Saul being alive, stating evidence both for and against. And it should also be noted that the evidence for his death was a much longer list than against. However, fellow editor Joe Kiddo didn't take kindly to that kind of talk. And so he felt the need to respond with the following. Oh, come on, Justin. Saul is dead, and that's the fact, so please stop trying to be full of yourself and leave Saul in the dead category, okay? Peace out, man. But Justin, he's not the kind of guy to just sit there and take that from Joe Kiddo, so he snapped back with, "You're talking to me about being full of himself, Joe? You're the one who said flat out that we should all just shut up and let you run the wiki and do whatever you like. I don't think you have much room to talk on this particular matter." And let history show that Justin was indeed correct to ask this question. And we're very fortunate that he didn't just shut up and let Joe run the wiki. But these were the two sides of the Jaguar D Saul argument personified as One Piece wiki editors. Now, if we're talking purely logically, then I would call Saul's incident a fake-out death, because he was frozen by Kuzan, and no one has ever died from being frozen by Kuzan. In our very first encounter with him, Robin and Luffy were frozen with the same ability, and look, they were just fine. Plus, Kuzan was a close friend of Saul, and I don't feel like Kuzan is the kind of guy to carry out an execution. It would be a lot different if we were looking at, say, Arlong and Belmer. If it was revealed down the line that Belmer had survived, then that would be completely impossible to sell, because Arlong is a ruthless fish death merchant, and there is no way that he would not have finished the job, because he enjoys the job. Logically, Kuzan, he is also Mr. Lazy Justice. He's not someone who's defined by his finishing of jobs, unlike Sakazuki and his thorough justice. We also don't see Saul's body, and the closest we do get to a confirmation is Spandine in chapter 398, who does say that Saul died, but he's making an assumption. And in that same breath, he also makes the assumption that Saul was the one who helped Robin escape, despite the rudder of his own ship being frozen, and somehow not putting two and two together, with the ice logie of Vice Admiral sitting right behind him at the moment that he made the statement. So logically, Spandine's words can't be trusted, and Saul's death is left as a juicy question mark. And therefore, it is a clear case of a fake-out death, except things get a bit more tricky when we look at it from an emotional standpoint. This whole chapter was dedicated to Saul and Robin. Saul said that this was the end for him. He gave a beautiful speech about finding friends, no one is born to be alone, etc. Plus, his last panel is him frozen with the classic Will of D death smile. And in context, flashback characters are extremely fragile and even expected to die when playing the role of the mentor. So Saul's survival here is kind of like going to see Romeo and Juliet and then having them both alive at the end of the play. It is a bold maneuver, but not at all conventional. And I'm very much of the opinion that emotionally, this is a false death scene. Logically, yes, there are ways that Saul could have survived and obviously did survive, but this is a very clear emotional full stop. And where I think One Piece often really crosses the line is when a death scene is both emotional and logical. Again, like Pell, who was a full stop all around. It was emotional and there was no logical way for him to escape. But even with that said, I would still personally classify Saul as a false death scene. And I hate those with a passion. But I don't hate what happened here. So why do I feel differently about Saul? Well, in his video, Mr. Moore spends a lot of it addressing community feedback and online arguments in favor of Saul's survival. And I don't think that's usually a helpful way to go about topics like this. A lot of creators get tunneled into arguing against what one dude said on Twitter instead of looking at the broader picture. So instead of focusing on the specific things that individuals have said, I think that we should address the broader question, which is, what is it about Oda's writing that makes this situation feel different? Because whether you agree with it or not, this Robin and Saul situation is very different from every other false death, which usually met with near universal condemnation. But in this case, the response has been overwhelmingly positive, at least with my audience, who I do consider to be the most intelligent and physically attractive of all audiences, and over 80% of which are satisfied with Saul being alive. That is a big number. I almost never get this kind of colossal majority consensus in these polls, but I do think that there's a very easy answer to this, which is that it's not about Saul, it's not about the logic of his survival, it's not even about losing the weight of his sacrifice. I don't think that most people are even thinking about Saul at all, because it's all about everything that we've just gained with Robin. Robin here is everything. Seeing Robin's reaction in chapter 1066 after learning that Saul was alive took me quite off guard, and I even said as much in my chapter review that week. Let's talk about what could be arguably the biggest reveal of the chapter, which is that Jaguar D Saul is alive. Because usually this is the sort of thing that would annoy me. Fake deaths are my most disliked aspect of One Piece. I despise them, and I think that Oda can often be very greedy and incredibly clunky when implementing them. But I can't help feel differently about Saul, and I think a lot of that has to do with Robin. Here I can't help but be happy because seeing the evolution of expressions on Robin's face was a roller coaster. It started out reopening an old wound and making Robin genuinely sad, and then those tears transformed into eyes lit up with a spark of hope. And finally, they became tears of joy when Robin realized that Saul was alive. It was so good. In that chapter, Robin's tears were like a magical elixir that healed all of my issues with Saul's survival. Her reaction to the news completely countered my cynicism to the narrative act itself. And to that you might say, man on the internet, so what? There's always a heartfelt reaction from a character who cared about that person, right? Well, not right, actually. I'd even go so far as to say wrong. Because as absolutely insane as this sounds, this is the first time that we have seen this happen. One of the biggest mistakes that Oda made with Pell, apart from not just keeping him dead, was revealing him to be alive, but not showing us Vivi's reaction. At the end of Alabasta, we see that Pell's alive, but we don't see him again until Garatsu's cover story, where he's part of Vivi's entourage casually visiting the hot springs. And to make things worse, the first shot that we see of Vivi and Pell together is so impersonal. All we see are their backs. And the only way that Oda could have made this moment less emotional is if he turned them both into pacifista. It is such an incredibly unbelievable fumble from Oda to not show us the moment that Vivi learned that Pell was alive. And that's why it feels so cheap, because Oda took an emotion away from us, which was the weight of Pell's sacrifice. But he didn't refill that empty space with anything else. However, when it comes to Robin, the weight of Saul's sacrifice is now gone, but that void has been filled with Robin's overwhelming joy. And that's very easy for me to get on board with, because Robin's emotions are infectious. And this is a very consistent failure with Eiichiro Oda's false death scenes. We almost never get to feel the impact that a character actually being alive has on the people that were close to them. Another infamous example is Pound from Whole Cake Island. He survived his false death scene, but we don't get anything from Charlotte Chiffon because she didn't even know that Pound was her father. Prior to Capone Gang Beija's cover story, they had no connection, and before this moment, Pound wasn't important to Chiffon at all. So Pound being alive doesn't give us that same joy that was sparked with Robin and Saul. Again, Oda took away one emotion, Pound's sacrifice, and he didn't refill that space with anything. It just leaves us feeling empty. And you know what? Let's continue going through the list. When Igaram returned to Alabasta after his false death, we do actually get one reaction panel of Vivi where she's shocked to see him alive, but that's it. There's no tears, there's no real emotion other than surprise. Vivi just says, Igaram? And then goes off to find the Straw Hats, and we never speak of it again. And it really is as if there's no tangible difference between Igaram being alive or dead, because we don't get to see that moment, if indeed there was a moment, of how it affected Vivi to see him alive, to have him again, to regain what she lost. Instead, it's portrayed as if Vivi doesn't care, and if she doesn't care, then why should I? So I, as a reader, don't care, and I do feel a little bit robbed when I think about Igaram's death scene at Whiskey Peak. To move on to Skypiea, Pagaya's survival is played as a joke, so it's not designed to be a somber, emotional moment anyway. But even if it was, Konus isn't a character that we'd spent anywhere near enough time with to have that level of empathy with her. There's just one wide shot of Konus crying in her father's lap after she finds out that he's still alive, and it's all very impersonal. It's incredibly difficult to emote with people from that kind of distance. The feeling portrayed in this one panel isn't even 1% of what Oda created when he had Pagaya sacrifice himself to save Konus. So again, I'm gonna repeat it, I as a reader am left empty. Oda took something away and didn't replace it with something of equal value. And this is where Eiichiro Oda has consistently failed as an author, in my opinion, by not making his readers feel the joy of the survival that his characters is supposed to bring those around them. He almost always rushes, botches, or doesn't even bother with these absurdly important reunions and emotional impacts, and that's what makes his false death scenes feel like such a violent kick in the sabos. But that's also why this one works, because with Robin, Oda didn't handle this with his usual flippancy. He made sure that the weight of Saul's sacrifice was going to be replaced with something of equal value. And even though, again, I despise false death scenes, I can't look at Robin's tears of joy and not love what's happening on this page. Because Robin, the rest of the Straw Hats, and the extended cast of One Piece are all such tangible characters to me that I am more than happy to be swept up in their emotional experience. But that's the key, they actually need to have that emotional experience, which in the case of almost every other false death, they do not. But we should also talk about how Saul's survival was implemented, which is very unlike other false deaths. Saul's survival was revealed to us in chapter 1066, which was published in November 2022. So that is almost exactly 2 years on the dot before Robin would be reunited with Saul in early December 2024. And those 2 years of real world time are extremely relevant because it primes you for this moment. If you did have issues with Saul being alive, then 2 years ago was the time to work through them. Oda gave us a very big buffer between that revelation and the reunion, so that those issues would be less present at the eventual reunion. And another big building block towards this was then added in chapter 1114, where we see Saul on Elbaf waiting for Robin, and even more importantly in chapter 1131, where we saw Robin go back to her pre-time skip hairstyle in anticipation of seeing Saul. Which, despite all of the amazing stuff that happened with Luffy and Loki, the predominant online discussion of this chapter was all about Robin's hair. And it is so difficult to look at this panel and not be excited for Robin, to not actively want her to have this regardless of it being yet another false death scenario. So the point is that this was implemented in stages, whereas almost every other survival reunion comes out of completely nowhere and it's dealt with in a single panel if it's dealt with at all. And if that was the case here, say we hadn't heard anything about Saul, then landed on Elbaf and Robin just found him lying on a beach, then this would seem like a ridiculous ass pull out of nowhere. So implementation definitely matters. And as we've explored, Oda has been traditionally quite abysmal in this area. However, a lot of this also boils down to your own personal emotional maths. For me, the addition of Robin's happiness and how well this reunion was handled is a net positive after subtracting the flashback sacrifice. Because I'm not saying that we haven't lost anything with Saul, I do think we have. But what I gained from Robin feels more valuable than that. However, if you're not as attached to Robin, then I can see that being a net negative. And I'm not saying you're wrong if that is the case, and I'm certainly not defending Oda implementing yet another false death. But I do think that after almost 30 years of writing One Piece, Oda may have finally found the way to have his cake and eat it too. Although I do hope that this doesn't set a precedent. I really don't want to see too much more of this, if any of it, going forward. But also, this is One Piece, and if this does have to happen, then what happened with Robin and Saul is the best possible way to implement it. Elbaf is an arc that was never meant to happen. Ever since 2022, there has been an industry rumor circulating within those close to the One Piece manga production, a rumor that Eiichiro Oda himself has since gone on to confirm, with the decision to actually have an Elbaf arc being made shockingly recently, and we've already seen the effects of what is a much more improvised arc than we would have initially thought. The vast majority of people that I've encountered in this fanbase have always taken for granted that Elbaf was always going to happen. When I say always, I mean from the very moment it was mentioned. I remember having discussions about going to Elbaf in the mid-2000s. And knowing what I do now, I feel incredibly fortunate that we actually got to set foot on this island. So I'm going to tell you why Elbaf wasn't planned, why it was eventually picked up at the last second, and some interesting plot holes that this decision has already caused in One Piece. Now, I don't use the term plot holes lightly. I think that these days people use the term plot hole to describe something that they were generally dissatisfied with, and not in its actual meaning. But let's begin with a man, a Japanese man, nay, a Japanese comedy man by the name of Noda Crystal, who works for a company called Yoshimoto Entertainment, one of the largest talent management agencies in all of Japanland. And it's an agency that's often used by the publishing industry to promote their products, be it games, movie, films, or in this case, manga, because their talent are quite frequently hired to host Shueisha events. And Noda Crystal has even been on the official Japanese One Piece YouTube channel. He also happens to have his own YouTube channel where he does, get this right, he sits in a room and talks to people about his mind thoughts on the internet. Couldn't be me. And in a now deleted video that was promptly re-uploaded by someone else, Noda Crystal revealed some inside information regarding the Elbaf arc. And the following is a translation of said information from Dawn and Dusk, a fantastic One Piece channel that I featured before, who you should absolutely check out because it provides a Japanese perspective of One Piece in English and points out a lot of stuff that we missed due to getting lost in translation. But I digress. Here is what Noda Crystal said. I've been hearing bits and pieces of rumors here and there. Just to be clear, these are just rumors, but it's been said for a while now that there wasn't originally a plan to go to Elbaf. I heard that rumor. Then I also heard another rumor that they seem to have decided to go to Elbaf after all. I'm not going to say where this information comes from, and please don't ask for more details, but based on the whispers I've heard, the plan wasn't to go to Elbaf, but now it looks like they will. And I was surprised, like, oh, they're going to Elbaf. So yeah, I think they're headed to Elbaf after all. That last statement doesn't seem anything particularly enlightening, but this video was posted in 2023, so it was pretty damn enlightening for the time. And despite having gotten rid of this video, Noda Crystal has also gone on to reiterate this point in a much more recent 2024 video. And in the more recent video, he also predicts that Elbaf will take 3 years to complete, and that One Piece as a whole will take 10 more years to finish. Although I should note that this is purely his personal speculation, there are no mystery sources cited here, but he does a breakdown of what he thinks the final arcs will be and how long each of them will take. Very classic YouTuber behavior, we're all guilty of it. But it is very interesting to see someone who is an insider as opposed to a dude in a room giving his opinion about manga production and the idea that One Piece is probably not ending anytime soon. And he's not the only source that this has come from, although the others are much more difficult to track down. But within the Japanese community, there was an understanding that Elbaf was likely not happening as far back as 2022. And you might be asking, but man on the internet, how can we other men on the internet trust the words of a third man on the internet? Well, these words are shockingly trustworthy because man not on the internet very much, Eiichiro Oda has confirmed them himself. So firstly, let's take a look at the end date of One Piece timeline. In 2020, Oda was interviewed on YouTube and said that his plan was to finish One Piece in 5 years' time, marking that end date at 2025. Then in 2022, Oda conducted an interview with Detective Conan author Gosho Aoyama, which was really fun. There's this very cool format in the manga industry where they get two famous authors together and have them interview each other instead of having it run by a third party, which means that you get all sorts of interesting questions being asked by someone who has an intimate understanding of the industry. And these interviews don't get a lot of attention, but they should. Especially this one because Oda told Aoyama that his personal goal at the time was to end One Piece within 3 years, which is still in keeping with the 5-year timeline he gave during 2020. Meaning that there is no way that Oda was planning on doing Elbaf in 2020 or even 2022. And this isn't just my personal speculation. This is what Oda directly said in his Jump Festa 2024 message, which was actually released in 2023 because who cares about naming your event what the actual date is, Japan? If Luffy and crew manage to make it out of Egghead safe and sound, do you think they might go to that island? I mean, I thought up a route that doesn't involve it, but I'm not sure I could stop Luffy even if I wanted to. If they do go, you know that means there's going to be a no-holds-barred struggle to obtain that thing. So the key part here is Oda saying that he had already thought up a way to continue One Piece without going to Elbaf, and perhaps had not even previously been considering it. And I think we can pinpoint where this decision was changed by looking at the message from the previous year's Jump Festa. And next year, in the original One Piece story, unexpectedly, that guy and that guy are going to fight. It'll be a story like that. If I had to give it a title, it would be Great Free-for-All Fight. I hope nobody dies. So look, whatever he was talking about there never happened. There was no great free-for-all fight. Egghead Island was a fairly straightforward affair of Straw Hats versus world government, and there was no that guy and that guy fighting. Which, if you're unfamiliar, whenever Oda says things like that guy, he's usually referring to someone not involved in the current arc and using vague language to avoid outright spoiling it. So I think that what he said in that message was the plan for what should have been happening now instead of Elbaf. After Egghead Island, I think that Oda really was gearing straight up to go into whatever this battle royale was. Be that the race to claim the One Piece or something else. But we were really truly heading into the endgame and aiming for Oda's original end date, but then a change was made. And this was probably done through a combination of two reasons. The first being that I think Oda may have felt that too much had been set up that needed Elbaf to happen in order to neatly tie things together. Elbaf is a very important destination for Usopp, as when departing Egghead Island, Usopp even calls it the island of his dream, and it's so hard to imagine what Oda was planning without him going there. Perhaps Usopp was going to become a brave warrior of the sea first, and then visit Elbaf after the end of One Piece. But there are other threads, like Harudin, who was introduced stating that he was going to become king of the giants. So there was a definite story there. And of course, the Whole Cake Island connection between Big Mom, Lola, and Loki, which was actually set up all the way back on Thriller Bark. And if you count in the original Little Garden event, as well as meeting Oimo and Kashi at Enisobi, it really does seem like we've spent an incredible amount of time setting up an island that, if we were to skip, would negate all of the fantastic work put into building it, be it accidental or intentional. After visiting Fishman Island and knowing that we will eventually visit Laugh Tale, Elbaf has been the #1 most expected island to visit post-time skip. And you know what? Probably pre-time skip as well. It was expected by everyone except Oda himself, apparently. And I do think that the pressure of tens of millions of readers worldwide looking forward to this arc could have played a part in deciding to do it. But I also think that the publisher would have had a lot to say here. Because if I was Shueisha, I would be doing everything I could to extend One Piece as long as possible. Because it is one of the top 20 highest grossing media franchises in human history, with a total revenue now exceeding $22 billion US, with half of that revenue being generated by manga sales alone. And Shueisha's in a bit of an awkward position with other series. Jujutsu Kaisen and My Hero Academia finished this year, and every year there seem to be less and less series in the top 10 highest selling manga from Shueisha. So when it comes to convincing Eiichiro Oda to slip in a bit of Elbaf before the final war, I think that Shueisha would have been even more eager than we fans are. Which is a really interesting idea because last minute arcs are not uncommon in One Piece history, but it's usually the other way around. Oda and his editors decide to either skip or compress. Such as when Green Bit was planned to be its own arc and came within a handful of chapters of actually starting before the decision was made to semi-skip it and head straight to Dressrosa instead. And of course, famously, Punk Hazard is a combination of two arcs, one that Oda planned on a fire island and another on a snow island. And it's even speculated that Whole Cake Island and the Germa Kingdom were going to be separate arcs as well. So we may have now entered a new era where Shueisha is encouraging Oda to extend rather than compress. But what is the impact of this on the thing it is we actually care about, the story? Well, one of the biggest signs that Elbaf wasn't planned is actually the man of the hour, Prince Loki himself, as a lot of people were incredibly surprised and stunned and in awe of our first proper introduction to Loki, because even by One Piece standards, he looks and functions nothing like his original silhouette. As introduced to us on Whole Cake Island, Loki was definitely more of a rounded, wacky character who definitely doesn't seem on the destroying the whole world side of the spectrum. I mean, the silhouette effect is nothing new. Characters often end up bearing very little physical resemblance to their teaser silhouettes, which are drawn years, sometimes a decade in advance. But what I will say for most silhouettes is that they usually maintain the spirit of the character. Like Kaido's crazy silhouette on Water 7, that is a joke compared to his eventual design, but it did still capture the essence of what he was, which is not a good dude. But that is because Kaido was planned. One Piece was originally going to be a story focused on bringing down the four emperors, and exactly when Kaido manifested in Oda's mind is unknown, but he knew roughly where he wanted to go when he drew the silhouette. However, Loki is completely different because his ultimate role in the story was not planned, and we have other examples of this having happened before. One Piece has this fairly well-established wacky to awesome character pipeline, with a great example being the original design of Charlotte Katakuri. He was going to be this twig-legged mega-torso with a funky pompadour, and the way I describe this design is generic. Not generic by regular manga standards, but generic by standards of the Charlotte family. Every Charlotte sibling who isn't a major focus has this similar wacky but not intended to be functional design that look really cool and help build the world, but can't really make an oomph on the story itself. I'm thinking characters like Charlotte Mash Tsukoto or Pisans, the guy in the reindeer onesie. The original Katakuri design fits in perfectly with the rest of his family, and my personal theory as to why Oda changed Katakuri is because he realized he needed an antagonist that wasn't Big Mom on Whole Cake Island, someone who Luffy could actually fight and defeat. And none of his remaining Charlotte designs could get the job of a major arc antagonist done, so he went back and he coolified Katakuri, giving him a very no-nonsense threat aesthetic, and I think that could be what happened here with Loki as well. Because if you think about it, if Elbaf was never supposed to be its own arc, then it never needed its own antagonist. Oda didn't need to think about having someone to command the story and challenge Luffy on the island. So when he originally drew Loki, it was more of a derpy monarch, but after the decision was made to make Elbaf a whole arc, we needed a villain. Someone we could take seriously, and so Loki was given the Katakuri treatment, the no-nonsense serious threat aesthetic. This is all assuming that Loki is the main antagonist of Elbaf, which at this stage, and it's not a given. We don't know, this video could age terribly, but we'll see. But the other very noticeable shift is with Dory and Broggy, because I don't think that their fight was supposed to be paused so that they could return. When speaking to Usopp on Water 7, Oimo says, "If our bosses are still dueling, we can't go near that island. We're going to stay here for a while and make ourselves useful before returning to Elbaf." So that, to me, seems fairly straightforward and quite ironclad. For the sake of all of the honor and warriorness, as much as it pains them, they need to leave their captains alone to settle their business. But after Egghead Island, it's revealed that Oimo and Kashi did go to Little Garden because, after we parted ways with you folks at Water 7, we wanted to catch a glimpse of the captains, so we headed for Little Garden. Which I think is not only a pretty weak excuse after such a strong conviction being set up on Water 7, but it is also a straight up plot hole. Oimo and Kashi did not go to Little Garden after Water 7 because their cover story showed them departing for Elbaf. And the cover story 2 years later showed that Dory and Broggy were still fighting on Little Garden. And you can tell exactly what time period it takes place in because above them is the newspaper about the Straw Hats reuniting on Sabadi. If Oimo and Kashi had gone to Little Garden after Water 7, pre-time skip, skip, then Dory and Broggy wouldn't still be fighting post-time skip. Or if they were, they would have gone back and be fighting with fresh weapons. So at most, Dory and Broggy left Little Garden 2 months ago, which doesn't track with what Oimo and Kashi is saying. And all of which is me saying that I think this is a clear result of not having planned the Elbaf arc and some minor issues we've had fitting it in, because if we're gonna have an adventure on the Island of Giants, then yes, it would be phenomenal to have Dory and Broggy involved and bring everything full circle. So what we gotta do is we gotta make a little mess for the greater good of bringing them in. Because as much as plot holes are a bit annoying, something as minor as this is completely worth it for that moment that Dory and Broggy reunited with Luffy on Egghead and took on the 5 elders together. And that sentiment really is the greater point of this video. It's not to say, whoa, watch out everyone, we're in shaky improvised territory on the Island of Giants. What I'm saying is actually very much the opposite. I'm making this video now because I want it on the record that when all of this works out and Oda draws a story that looks so perfectly planned that it becomes impossible to imagine One Piece without Elbaf, just remember that none of this was meant to happen and it'll be a pure flex of Oda's narrative ability to make it seem like it was. But as for the big question, now that we've started Elbaf, when will One Piece actually end? Well, I have a whole video on that, which I highly recommend checking out next. The one thing live-action One Piece will never overcome is time and money, which is actually 2 things, but just stick with me here. Money is used to buy time. We have this amount of money which can produce this amount of episodes. But live-action One Piece is already one of the highest budget TV shows of all time. So it's already hitting the money ceiling and therefore the time ceiling. And as a result, there are a limited amount of episodes that can be produced per season, which means that brutal cuts need to be made. Cuts that have severe knock-on effects. And for this video, I'm focusing exclusively on the Baratie arc. Eiichiro Oda built the House of One Piece meticulously. Every character exists for a reason, even if you don't consciously pick up on it. And they exist usually to inform or build the characters that we are consciously aware of. These are what I'm going to refer to as building block characters, and they come in an assortment of roles, but each of them serves a necessary purpose. However, when it comes to the restrictions of time, these are the first characters to be cut, meaning that we end up losing a lot of our building blocks and the structure starts to become quite unsound. And the first block to examine is a good old slab of Lieutenant Iron Fist Full Body, someone who I never thought I would miss, and I don't really, but what I do miss is Full Body's impact on everyone else. Full Body is the first character we meet in the manga for the Baratie arc. The Straw Hats come across a Navy vessel and then have some words with a very arrogant Full Body who promises to let them go because it's his day off, and he has a bit of a hot date at Baratie with Moody. But as soon as he's out of earshot, Full Body orders his men to fire on the Going Merry, and this tells us everything we need to know about him, which is that even though he puts on this show of bravado, he's a fraud. And you can't trust a single thing he says. Which transitions quite nicely into his meal at Baratie, where he's describing the flavors of the wine and everyone's all super impressed, until Sanji says that absolutely nothing he said so far has been correct. And as a reader, this is incredibly satisfying, because we've already seen this guy betray our crew and establish himself as an antagonistic presence. He was a prick to us, so seeing him humiliated is a great shot of Schadenfreude right to the veins. And Full Body's actions from this point on make a lot of sense. We've established that he has such a fragile ego that of course he's going to try and humiliate Sanji, which is why he puts the fly in the soup. That fly's name is Bachi, by the way. And when that doesn't work, Full Body resorts to violence, and that doesn't end well. But my god, is it satisfying to watch. Because again, he'd already crossed us. He's the reason why the Straw Hats have a problem on Baratie at all. Now in the live action, Full Body does exist for all of 45 seconds. He appears in Baratie, and he's having an argument with a character that most One Piece fans won't recognize. But this is Crescent Moon Galley, the antagonist for the prototype of One Piece Romance Dawn version 1. He also appears in the actual series after Whole Cake Island, but this is the sort of thing that live action actually does really well, which is taking these historical One Piece treasures and sprinkling them in for our viewing pleasures. But what this incident boils down to is that Galley is upset because Full Body took his table. Now whether that actually happened or not, we don't know, but a fight breaks out, and this is used as an opportunity to showcase Sanji, who promptly beats the two of them up, and we move on. We never see him again. So we took a character who in 12 pages of manga has a fully fleshed out character arc, as well as an extremely satisfying conclusion, and we had to water that down to 45 seconds of essentially angry man gets into a fight. In fact, I would argue that we learn more about Galley, the Easter egg character, than we do about Full Body, the actual series character. Because Galley is the one instigating the situation, he gets the majority of the dialogue, and he is the overall more memorable presence. And I do think it's a slight concern when the Easter Easter egg characters are being given more substance than the ones Oda created as building blocks to tell very specific aspects of his story. I'm not saying that Full Body himself is the make or break of live action One Piece, and it is nice to have his character arc in the manga because stuff like that is a huge part of what makes One Piece feel like a living, breathing world. That these minor characters get to have these full short stories. But look, it was never about Full Body. Again, he himself is a building block. It's all about the effects that Full Body had on our main characters, which is significantly greater than you may remember. For one, in the live action, we don't even know that Full Body's a Marine, which is a big deal because it sets up the Baratie is a no-nonsense establishment and it shows just how serious Sanji is about food. Sanji only fights Full Body because he wasted soup, and the fact that Sanji is willing to openly attack a Marine officer for this transgression shows that he's willing to stand against the entire world for this belief. So even something as simple as not knowing that Full Body's a Marine has a serious impact on how we view Sanji, because from the live action perspective, he's just beating up some dude. But more importantly, Full Body is also the reason why Luffy became a chore boy at the restaurant. Luffy was defending his ship from Full Body's attack and accidentally damaged not only Baratie, but also Zeph himself as a result, which is why Luffy becomes a chore boy for a year. And because we had to reduce Full Body's role in the live action, Luffy now needs another reason to get into this major plot point. So what happens is that Luffy tries to pay for a meal with his quote treasure tab and then gets conscripted into a year's worth of chores to pay it off, which still works, but subjectively doesn't really work that well for me. In the manga, Luffy ends up in this position because he takes responsibility for his actions. He doesn't say that it was the Marine's fault. He doesn't try to weasel his way out of it. He just accepts it and rolls with it. Whereas in the live action, Luffy ends up in this position because he's a moron, and Zeph drags Luffy into the kitchen like a child into a principal's office. And even though Luffy is a child at heart, one of these stories tells us a lot more about who Luffy is deep down, which is a straightforward, honorable, lovable goofball, whereas the other one makes him look like an untrustworthy child. Quite literally, because the camera angle even looks down on him, making Luffy look like a cheeky child in a classroom. And the missing ingredient in these two portrayals, weirdly enough, is Full Body. The reduction of an already minor character led to these drastically different outcomes. One Piece is a structure. Individual components of the structure don't seem important out of context. Like you don't look at a brick and go, huh, that's the house. Full Body was a minor component who contributed to a huge effect. And that's just a minor character. What happens when we remove or reduce major characters? Funnily enough, another weird effect of reducing Full Body is the introduction of Gin, a medium-sized building block. Because Gin was originally a prisoner aboard Full Body's ship who escapes and then starts causing trouble at Baratie. You know, thinking about it, without Full Body, Baratie would have been quite a pleasant side trip. But Gin is treated like utter garbage the moment he steps into the restaurant. Because he has no money, he's beaten up, called all sorts of assorted names like scum and the more scum, and then he's thrown out. And it tells us so much about Sanji that Gin is the person he chooses to feed. The other chefs at Baratie served Full Body because he had the money, even if there was no appreciation for the food. Whereas Gin had no money, but in his starving state, he understands the value of food on the same level as Sanji. And that's why Sanji decides to feed him and Gin breaks down crying at the gesture. This is the other side of the Full Body coin, and it continues to tell us everything we need to know about Sanji. Within these two interactions, we have a precise understanding of Sanji's moral compass. Two interactions that are missing from the live action, and therefore not really giving us what we need with Sanji. And Gin is another character who is heavily reduced in the live action. He appears out of nowhere in the back of the kitchen of the restaurant and says 6 words. Please help me, I'm so hungry. And Sanji, of course, obliges. He cooks for Gin despite having been told by Zeph that he can't do any of the cooking, and that does give us some insight into who Sanji is, but it feels significantly watered down. Without seeing everyone else treat Gin like complete scum, Sanji treating Gin like a human loses a lot of its oomph. And without having seen Full Body's outright disregard for the value of food, Gin's appreciation of Sanji's gesture loses the bulk of its impact as well, which leaves Sanji himself very simmered down, having lost 2 of his key character moments in this arc. Not to mention that the entire scene feels very convenient. The fact that Gin comes knocking at just the right time, he also appears out of nowhere. I mean, Gin says that he was drifting for a week after being the only survivor of Mihawk's attack in the Grand Line, and yet somehow Gin got to Baratie before Mihawk did. Now, in fairness to the live action, Gin never says that he was part of Don Krieg's crew, and I think for the only way for this to make sense timeline-wise is to assume that he wasn't, because Garp appears to call Mihawk, who's fighting the Krieg pirates, on the same day that the Straw Hats reach Baratie, and Gin gets there that evening, despite stating that he was adrift for a week. Feels a lot like trying to put a puzzle together, but we only have half the pieces. We need to build the same structure, but we're missing half the materials. Getting rid of all the Full Body build-up means that we don't have a core understanding understanding of Sanji's food philosophy. We also don't have a way of getting Gin to Baratie or a decent reason for Luffy to become a chore boy. Now you might say that Gin, he doesn't need a great reason to get there because he disappears after this moment. He's another one and done, and fair enough, but that is also a pretty big issue. Again, it's not about Gin himself. It's about Gin's impact on Sanji. Gin is a tool for us to get to Sanji's arc development. Much like Sanji, Gin is a man trapped by obligation. Despite his wishes to leave the Krieg pirates, he has a fierce loyalty to Don Krieg himself, which is what Gin needs to overcome over the course of the Battle of Baratie. And Sanji watches as Gin struggles to choose between Krieg and Sanji himself, the man who saved his life. And in the end, Gin makes the decision to live for himself, even if that life won't be particularly long due to all of the poison it is that he inhaled. Gin is a mirror to Sanji. Sanji feels indebted to Zeph for saving his life. And in the same way that Gin feels like he needs to attack Baratie for Krieg, Sanji feels obliged to stay at the restaurant and continue to defend it for Zeph. So seeing Gin overcome this is a big step in Sanji's own personal development. Gin chose a short but free life over a long and trapped life. He teaches Sanji the value of pursuing your own dreams and desires, which is a big part of Sanji deciding to depart with Luffy to go and find the All Blue. And in the absence of all of that, I'm not sure where Sanji gets this motivation from in the live action. So at one point, Luffy does say, "Don't let some stubborn old man get in the way of your dream." And the thing that appears to push Sanji over the edge is Zeph saying, "Quitting is staying here. It's one thing to have a dream, it's another to go after it." Which is actually a great line. I like it a lot, but those two lines are not enough. It's a very boring and overused phrase, but actions speak louder than words, and in the ironically named live action, there are no actions that inform Sanji's decision, only words. He's not there for the Zoro versus Mihawk fight, which he did witness in the manga, and much like he did with Gin, what happened here was Sanji witnessing a man prepared to die to follow his desires. But he doesn't get that in the live action. In the manga, Sanji also witnesses Luffy prepared to die to take down Don Krieg, and in fact he would have died if Sanji had not stepped in, and this was the turning point for Sanji because at that stage, he'd witnessed three people who all value freedom and desire above a long life. Gin, Zoro, and Luffy, each of the three going on to inspire Sanji to make his decision. These are the three pushes that get Sanji out of the door of Baratie. And in the live action, he doesn't get any pushes. After his one scene, Gin is non-existent, Sanji isn't present for the Mihawk fight, which I can't explain. I don't know why they left both he and Zeph out of it. And because Don Krieg gets removed, Sanji is robbed of that moment of seeing Luffy succeed and reinforcing that he was the right man to follow out of this restaurant. I've said this before, but the live action has a line that always makes me laugh. It's in episode 6 when Zeph and Sanji are having their discussion and Sanji just spits out, "Yeah, well, the chore boy offered me a spot on his crew, so maybe I'm gonna do that." And whilst this does make me laugh each and every time, I also feel a sense of pain because this is very indicative of how live action Sanji thinks of live action Luffy. At this point in the series, Luffy has done nothing of worth in front of Sanji. He let his crewmate get slaughtered by Mihawk, his navigator betrayed him, Usopp got drunk at the bar, and Luffy himself got obliterated by Arlong. So of course Sanji still refers to him as the chore boy instead of Captain or even Luffy, because the only thing of substance that Sanji has seen from Luffy in the live action is washing dishes. So as a result, in the live action, it feels more like Sanji leaves after having an argument with his dad and taking his first opportunity to sail away, rather than Luffy having to prove himself to Sanji, to earn Sanji calling him Captain instead of chore boy. So speaking of the whole chore boy thing, I know I've brought this up a lot as well, but we never found out how Luffy got out of being a chore boy. In the manga, it's because he makes a deal with Zeph that if he can defeat Don Krieg, then his debt will be forgiven, which again shows Luffy as quite an honorable, lovable goofball. He does wacky things and sometimes they turn out badly, and if so, you know what Luffy does? He makes them better. But the live action just forgets this is a thing. Despite the episode being called The Chef and The Chore Boy, and having both Sanji and Zeph refer to Luffy as the chore boy, we don't ever find out how Luffy gets away from being the chore boy in the entire episode. And it hits me because Luffy doesn't earn his way out of the problem that he caused. Which in the manga would be one thing because you can argue that it wasn't his fault. But in the live action, it is 100% his fault. It happens because he's an idiot and he gets out of it without doing anything. And whilst this isn't in the Baratie arc, it definitely makes me believe Garp in episode 8 when he says that Luffy isn't ready for the Grand Line. I agree with him. Live action Luffy is not ready. And that's the other issue with getting rid of Don Krieg, who was a very big chunky building block. He was such an important skill test for Luffy. Don Krieg is notorious in One Piece for being the guy who set sail into the Grand Line with big ambitions and then came running back after being decimated within days. Krieg isn't just another villain to be beaten. He is a non-optional step for Luffy. Because if Luffy can't defeat Don Krieg, Krieg, then of course he's not ready for the Grand Line. Krieg's role largely involves him laughing at Luffy's dreams and even looking down on his teeny tiny crew and saying stuff like, "Don't be so cocksure, kid. I have a fleet and 5,000 men. In 7 days we were smashed to bits in that demon sea." This is the point in One Piece where Luffy has to prove not just to Sanji but to all of us that he's ready to take on this challenge by defeating the person who failed. And it's also the first real display in One Piece of willpower overcoming more traditional aspects of strength. Don Krieg has 5,000 men, a colossal arsenal of weapons, indestructible golden armor, chemical weapons, and even the home field advantage of fighting a devil fruit user at sea. And Luffy goes on to prove that all of that is secondary to the sheer drive to succeed, which is symbolized at the end by Luffy breaking Krieg's indestructible armor with nothing but his bare palms. Probably my favorite moment of Luffy versus Don Krieg is when he equips his spike cloak and Luffy just punches him anyway. That's the moment where I really started to believe in Luffy. And in the live action, honestly, there is no point where I believe in him. Even against Arlong at the very end, Luffy admits that he can't beat him, which is the exact opposite of what he says in the manga. In the manga, what he says is, "All I can do is beat you." And in the live action, he can't even do that. So again, the biggest problem with the live action is that it will always be restricted by time, which means that we need to cut integral building blocks from this world. And once we start to cut too many of them, the structure, it begins to collapse. In the Baratier arc alone, what Luffy gets out of this arc is built on Don Krieg, who is built on Gin, who is built on Full Body. And it's no surprise that if you remove all three of these building blocks, Luffy comes out of Baratier having built nothing. Similarly, Sanji is built on both Luffy and Gin. But without Gin and without a structure for Luffy, he falls down as well. And so what we get out of him is very surface level. I'm not saying that the live action was wrong to do things this way. I actually think they did the best they could and they will continue to do the very best they can. I just personally don't think it's possible in the time they have. That's the enduring curse of live action, and I think it's only going to become more and more difficult to overcome in future seasons, but I wish them all the best, and I would love to be thoroughly proved wrong. So this is not the most fun video in the world to make, but we're gonna do our best regardless. Because Kazuki Yao, better known as the iconic voice of Frankie, as well as Bon Clay and Django, has officially retired from all of his roles due to unfortunate circumstances. We're going to talk about why this is, what impact it has on the cast of One Piece going forward, and more importantly, celebrate the legacy that Kazuki Yao has had on One Piece, and thank him for all of his work with some fun stories involving Oda, Cola, and the fact that the character of Frankie was designed by Oda to be voiced by this man. So firstly, I should put this out there, Kazuki Yao is still alive and well. I think a lot of people are going to see a video like this and assume he's passed away. Thankfully, he has not. But for those of you who have kept up with the One Piece anime for a few years now, you'll probably know that this has been a long time coming. Frankie's voice in the anime has been on a steady decline for many years now. It may not have been hugely noticeable because Frankie himself, honestly, hasn't had a whole lot to do in the story in the larger part of this decade, most of which has been spent on Wano. And Egghead has been, Frankie was there. He had a few cool moments, but he does feel like a very absent Straw Hat. And that might be why this has come as a surprise to many people, because we just haven't had the privilege of hearing Frankie all that often. But the following is Kazuki Yao's official statement. "The time has come for a sad farewell. Farewell to the dude I've spent almost a quarter of a century with. It kinda felt like an out-of-body experience, but I feel like a gap has formed between me and the Frankie I envision. And so I've decided to get off the sunny for now. I feel frustrated, I feel sad, I'm really sorry. However, we found a super replacement. Look forward to the announcement on December 22nd at Jump Festa." And I think that message hits particularly hard because Kazuki Yao mentions getting off the Thousand Sunny, which is, the ship that his character built and whose dream it is to sail around the world with. I know that when everything's all said and done, this is just a fictional pirate cartoon, but to me, that is incredibly tragic. Especially because Kazuki Yao is a man who really went above and beyond to create his characters. It's not as simple as an actor playing a role, especially in the case of Frankie, because a large part of Frankie was modeled after Yao himself. In fact, Frankie wouldn't be Frankie without Kazuki Yao. After hearing his performance of Django and Bon Clay, Eiichiro Oda created Frankie with Kazuki Yao's voice in mind. So he is, I think, the only Straw Hat whose voice actor was cast before the character even appeared in the manga. And so that does add a definite extra layer of sadness to think that Yao now believes that there is such a gap between the Frankie that he was and the Frankie that he is now, and that he's not able to live up to the past expectations that were created for him. So in this case, having the voice actor retire does feel like we are losing a large part of the character himself, and if you look at photos of a younger Kazuki Yao cosplaying Frankie, you can see that the resemblance is actually actually quite frighteningly accurate. Frankie cosplays are always a bit weird for me. One, because his body is difficult enough to create as is, but mostly because very few Frankie cosplayers are able to nail the facial expressions and the essence of Frankie. And I want it very much on the record that a large part of the essence of Frankie is this man. And again, it's not as if he just came on board with Frankie. Kazuki Yao has been with One Piece from pretty much the very beginning. He was Django and Bon Clay, so he's been involved ever since the days of East Blue. So we haven't just lost a straw hat, we have lost someone who's been with us on this journey from the very beginning. And I think it is remarkable that he stuck with Frankie for as long as he have and truly gave this role 120% of everything he had to give at every point in his career. As a side note, in Japan they say give 120% in the same way that we would say give 110%, which I find fascinating because even in impossible hypotheticals, Japan still has a heightened work ethic compared to the Western world. But it's not just vocal deterioration, but also physical. Recent photos of Kazuki Yao have been quite worrying because he's now extremely skinny, and to be clear, he's only 66 years old. We're not talking about some ancient 97-year-old Harada-style elder wizard. Kazuki Yao is still very young to be sporting this kind of physique, and I can only hope that he's able to live a long, happy, and healthy life in retirement. But this topic isn't purely restricted to him, because I think the harsh reality of this situation is that Kazuki Yao is probably going to be the first of many. One Piece is a unique series. There really are not that many shows that go on for 3 decades straight, and it comes with a lot of unique challenges that most projects never face. And we see that because every year we ask the question of, well, when is One Piece going to end? And every year that date keeps getting pushed back. I even have a video on this channel detailing the current theory that the One Piece manga is on track to end around 2032, regardless of whatever Oda says about wanting to end it earlier. And this does sound absurd if you haven't seen the video, but I would highly recommend watching it because it addresses a lot of pretty undeniable truths about the current state of the manga, as well as the situation that Oda has built for himself to resolve over the past 2.5 decades. But look, that's just the manga. However long it takes for the manga to end, you then need to add time on top of that for the anime to end. At least a year or two, and this is becoming an increasingly huge ask of the entire cast. The youngest of the Straw Hat crew is Nami's voice actor, Akemi Okamura. She's a very youthful 55, and that's because she was relatively unknown when she was cast as Nami, which was a risk that was able to be taken because the rest of the crew were filled up by much more veteran and established voice actors. Mayumi Tanaka, for example, Luffy's voice actor, was one of those veterans, and I just want to linger on that for a bit. She was considered a veteran voice actor in 1999 when One Piece started, and it's now 2024. She's well and truly graduated from veteran to one of the greatest legends in the industry, but Mayumi Tanaka is 69 and has publicly stated concerns that she may not be alive by the time that the One Piece anime ends. She's even had the rather morbid thought that she should probably choose a replacement for Luffy now, so that if the time comes, then fans will be able to accept that new person as Luffy. And that statement was made 4 years ago now. But Mayumi Tanaka has been thinking about this potential reality for even longer than that. And even though there are no public statements from them, you would have to assume that the rest of the Straw Hat voices have had to seriously consider this. Mayumi Tanaka has also stated that her voice acting career will end with Luffy. Although it's impossible to tell when that end will be, it's very possible that she could be in her 80s by the time that One Piece is truly over, which is not unprecedented because Dragon Ball's Goku is voiced by actor Masuko Nozawa, who is an astonishing 88 years old and still voicing Goku in the currently airing Dragon Ball Daima. And to put some weird perspective on that, she started her career as a child actress at the age of 3 and has been working consistently since, this is wild, since 1939, so from World War II onwards. And I bring her up because not only is Masuko Nozawa just amazing, but because a lot of people do tend to lean on her in discussions like this, but she is an extremely rare exception. We should not be holding other voice actors to the bar set by Masuko Nozawa because almost none of them are going to meet it. And to bring this back around to One Piece, she also happens to play the eternally youthful Dr. Kureha. But on a lighter note, Mayumi Tanaka, despite her worries about the future, is still very active. Most recently, she's been playing Turbo Granny in Dandadan. But this is definitely a concern for the entire crew. Remember, Nami at 55 is the youngest, while the rest of the crew are in their late 50s, 60s, and Jinbei's voice actor, Katsuhisa Hoki, is 77 years old. And that's just what happens when you have a show that's been running since 1999. If you really want to feel old and you're of a similar vintage to me, then here are some shocking facts. Chopper's voice actor, Ikue Otani, is actually better known as the voice of Pikachu, and Robin's voice actor, Yoriko Yamaguchi, is Nurse Joy. So a lot of these people have had careers longer than I've had life in general. And I'm no longer legally allowed to use the word young to describe myself, which is why I was really surprised when I made a video covering the Wit Studio One Piece remake and stated that, in my opinion, the Straw Hat should have a completely new cast for that project. Back then, I'd say opinion was split about 50-50. There were a lot of people who I think did see the realistic need for something like this, but also see it as a golden opportunity to pass One Piece on to the next generation. Because One Piece as a whole is a story about the new generation inheriting the world and choosing their own paths. So I think that having a whole new Straw Hat crew would be like Shanks passing the Straw Hat on to Luffy. And there will never be a better and cleaner chance in this. And I mean, what would be our best case scenario for this remake? Personally, I think the best case scenario would be for the remake to go through the entire series. But that is a task that is going to take well over a decade to complete. And as it is, again, we don't even know when the original One Piece anime is going to end. Realistically, it could take close to another 10 years from this moment at its current pace, because we still have no idea when the manga is going to end. So I think it's a wild idea to ask the current voice actors to sign on to a brand new One Piece series, a series that a lot of them definitely won't be able to finish, on top of the existing original anime commitment that even then they're not sure they'll be able to fulfill. It's not that I don't want them to be a part of the project, and quite frankly, the moment that Mayumi Tanaka officially retires from voice acting is going to feel like a family tragedy to me, because I've been listening to her every week for 2/3 of my life now. But I do think that Kazuki Yao's retirement has shown people why the unfortunate need for this exists, and there's definitely been a noticeable shift in opinion, with a very majorific 77% of Grand Fleet members thinking that this is the best opportunity to pass the torch on and keep One Piece going for a whole new generation of viewers. But to bring this back to Kazuki Yao, this is not all sad news. This is a celebration of a crazy career. And Oda, as alluded to before, has had quite a close relationship to him. In an SBS interview, Eiichiro Oda introduced Kazuki Yao as the quote, loud guy who handles all of One Piece's weird voices, and Oda then asked him out of Frankie, Bonclay, and Django, which is the character who resembles him the most. And Yao couldn't answer. He insisted that they were all him. And I think you can actually see that quite clearly, because when he was younger, Kazuki Yao actually cosplayed both Bonclay and Frankie. No Django representation that I'm aware of, but again, that Frankie, it looks pretty damn spot on. But there's also a photo of him from 2021 with the rest of the crew performing some Bonclay ballet kenpo in the background. In one interview, Kazuki Yao also stated that it was his secret plan to keep voicing One Piece characters until he eventually got a role on the crew. And he was going to be absolutely relentless with his vocals, and that definitely made an impression on Oda. But my favorite Kazuki Yao story is about the reaction that children started having to him after he began playing Frankie. This awesome cyborg man resonated with kids a lot more than his previous characters, and so from that moment on, whenever he was in public at a restaurant or something like that, Kazuki Yao made sure that he would always be drinking cola, so that just in case if any kids saw him, it would not break the illusion for them. What they would see is Frankie drinking cola, he'd go ow ow ow, and it would make their day. So I'm really going to miss Kazuki Yao as Frankie, and I really don't envy the new actor who at the time of this recording hasn't been announced yet. It'll be quite soon though, but this is going to be a rough job, especially because Frankie as a character doesn't have anything coming up that really gives him room to make his mark. It's all background and side gig stuff for the foreseeable future. But with that in mind, let's remember Kazuki Yao's words. He's retiring because he doesn't feel that he's able to bring the Frankie that he envisions to life, and so he is trusting this new voice actor with the character to meet that standard of Frankie, and I think that we should trust them as well. And while I don't think that any incarnation of thank you is going to be enough to properly respond to what this man has done for One Piece, that's what I'm going to say regardless. Thank you, Kazuki Yao, and we're all wishing you all the best in a well-deserved retirement. Zoro is not the first mate of the Straw Hat Pirates, or the vice captain, deputy director, co-chairman, or number 2 in the loo. Zoro is simply Zoro. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions in all of the One Piece. In canon material, Zoro has never, not once, been referred to as the first mate. And that's because Zoro's position in the crew was not intentional. It was the result of a series of pre-production incidents which pushed Eiichiro Oda's preferred vice captain out of the role, had a massive effect on the series as a whole, and completely completely changed how Oda viewed the structure of piracy. So what we should do first is we should actually define what a first mate is. To the uncultured swine, this might seem like a fairly straightforward discussion because Zoro, he was the first to join Luffy's crew and they're both very good friends, one even might say mates if you were particularly Australian. But the actual meaning of the first mate title has nothing to do with the order in which people join a crew. It signifies the individual with the most responsibility and authority behind the captain, which you may think was Zoro, but that was not the original plan. When Oda was still planning and sketching out One Piece, he had a fairly clear idea of what would eventually come to pass, which can be seen in the earlier known sketches of the Straw Hat crew, which not only includes the OG East Blue 5, but we also see prototypes of Smoking Chopper, Thin Frankie, Cowboy Brook, and a fishman that would evolve into a Jinbei. The only unplanned crew member was Nico Robin. But in addition to their designs, Oda had also quite clearly planned out each crew member's role. And what has always struck me as endlessly fascinating is that the prototype Usopp character was the vice captain and or first mate of the crew, which I think is why Usopp and Luffy have inherited one of the strongest dynamics within the Straw Hats. The two of them, they were instant best friends. So Zoro wasn't actually supposed to have as big of a role on the crew as he does in One Piece, not originally. In fact, I'd say he was probably intended to be around equal weighting with Sanji. And one of the reasons why I say that is because Oda also made a prototype manga called The Great Swordsman, about a rivalry between a samurai and a knight, which is the earliest known appearance of a prototype Sanji named Romeo, who was going to have a bitter rivalry with Ryuma, the character who inspired Zoro. So what changed? What ultimately elevated Zoro to that second-in-command position that we all assume he has? In theory, if Oda wanted to go with his original idea, then he probably would have had Luffy meet Usopp first, and that could very well have been the plan. But what changed is that during the prototype years, Oda briefly had the idea of turning One Piece into a dual protagonist series like The Great Swordsman, focusing on both Luffy and Zoro. The idea being that Oda was a bit nervous that Luffy was too goofy of a main character to carry the series on his shoulders alone. So for a while, Oda was very intent on introducing a more traditionally cool character as soon as possible to balance out Luffy's wackiness and add a bit more broad appeal to the early days of One Piece. Obviously, the dual protagonist idea never quite came to fruition, but that is why Luffy meets Zoro first, because Oda felt that the series needed that contrast as soon as possible. And so Zoro swooped in to take that second-in-command position away from Usopp. And at one stage, he was also going to take it away from Moji because there was also a point where Zoro was going to be a member of the Buggy Pirates, in what has been described as an elder brother role. So that's how all of that happened, and what we now have to deal with is the aftermath, which is the accidental placement of Zoro in a role that Oda didn't originally intend for him. And as a result, there isn't a single occasion in One Piece where Zoro is referred to as the first mate or the vice captain. There are certainly a lot of times where Zoro is mistaken by other characters as the captain because he is ever so powersome, but my personal speculation is that Oda has never labeled Zoro as the first mate or vice captain because in the early days he may still have been planning to give Usopp that role. However, as things progressed, Oda stopped seeing a need to define the first mate position. Before I continue, I would be remiss not to mention that there is a piece of official-ish media where Zoro is stated to be the first mate, and that would be the One Piece live action. In episode 5, Luffy's feeling a bit down after the Garp incident, and so Nami, Zoro, and Usopp agree that someone should have a talk with him, with Nami stating to Zoro, "You're his first mate." Kinda seems like that falls under your job description, which is a line that kind of annoys me. Not because they're defining Zoro as the first mate in this universe, that's cool, but because it's not consistent with the previous 4 episodes. Zoro begrudgingly accepts Nami's logic here and goes to have a very brief talk with Luffy, but he shouldn't have, because in the live action at this stage, he still hasn't actually joined the crew yet, let alone taken on a role. After Shellstown, Zoro and Nami were still insisting that they weren't a crew, and Zoro doesn't actually officially join until episode 6, so calling him the first mate here doesn't make any sense. What I think happened here is that the writer for episode 5 assumed that Zoro was going to join the crew after Shellstown, because that's how it happened in the manga. However, the writers of episodes 1 to 4 didn't do that at any stage, because they wanted to keep the whole not a crew gag going instead. And so what you end up with here is a fairly gaping plot hole. But the TLDR is that in the live action, yes, Zoro is the first mate, but it makes no sense. And in the manga, Zoro isn't the first mate, but also kind of is, thanks to a potentially confusing series of pre-production events. And this really hasn't become any clearer over time. These days, whenever the first mate question comes up, people are very quick to point their hand sausages at the color spread of chapter 1031. Very lovely piece of artwork featuring many familiar fan favorites. But hang on a second. Have you noticed the trend with all of these characters? Silver's Ray Lee, Ben Beckman, King Katakuri, and the rest? These are all of the characters who are either labeled as or assumed to be the right-hand men of their respective captains. Although in Katakuri's case, he's less of a first mate and takes on the role of an Asian firstborn, charged with the sacred duty of honoring his mother. Although he's not actually the firstborn child, that would be Charlotte Perospero, and he's busy luring children onto his candy escalator, which is the thing that actually happened. He told the children to, quote, lick his candy escalator. But here, Zoro is smack bang in the middle, and thus confirmed as the first mate / vice captain of the Straw Hats. Done deal. Video over, internet man. Like and subscribe. But there's just one big problem here, which is that Oda then went on to go out of his way to confirm that Zoro isn't the first mate as a result of this color spread. In the SBS of Volume 102, a very excitable fictional pirate fan asks the following question. Hello, Adachi. Looking at the cover page of chapter 1031, it seems like Beppo is the number 2 of the Heart Pirates, right? I was surprised, because I thought that Penguin, Shachi, and Beppo were all tied for number 2. Are you saying that Beppo with Sulong is the strongest between them? And to this, Oda replies, that cover, huh? Similar to Zoro, not all of those characters have the title of first mate. I selected the number 2s as I saw fit. Usually Shachi and Penguin are more dependable, but those two who have seen Beppo Sulong form are no match for Beppo in terms of fighting power. I acknowledge him. So if anything, what we have here is a power scaling diagram and not a first mate vice captain diagram. And another interesting point is that Oda posts time lapses of the production process of all of his color spreads, and the idea of drawing all of these number 2s was a bit of an accident. If you look at the time lapse, the original idea was to draw all of the important swordsmen in One Piece, which at one stage included characters like Mihawk and Toshigi, but Oda abandoned that idea and used the leftover Zoro to spawn the eventual color spread. And really, it's just fascinating that Oda not only goes out of his way in series not to define Zoro as the first mate, but actively confirms that he doesn't have this title in extended media. And on top of that, and this is something that we rarely think about, Oda almost never uses the first mate or vice captain titles in One Piece in general. There are shockingly few characters in the series as a whole who have the title of first mate or vice captain. In fact, almost no pirate crews use those titles. I can only give you 8 characters who have been defined as such. And now, to be fair, one of them is Silver's Ray Lee, who was formally introduced as the first mate of the Roger Pirates, and another very prominent figure is Ben Beckman, who was labeled as the first mate of the Red Hair Pirates all the way back in the SBS of Volume 5. But beyond the original concepts of One Piece, the title usage here gets a bit more shaky. During East Blue, we encounter Moji and Django, both of whom were first mates of the Buggy and Black Cat Pirates respectively, and then we don't see a single other first mate again until Jaya, where we meet Big Knife Sarkis, first mate of the Bellamy Pirates, and a character who I don't think anyone even knows exists named Okame, who was given the title of first mate of the Hoka Hoka Pirates in the Grand Blue data file. That's an example of how far I have to dig to find first mates in the series. They are exceedingly rare, and I'll tell you why in a second, but our final canon first mates are Boo, who was said to be the first mate of the Harpo Navy that we met on Dressrosa, and Aladdin, who was the first mate of the Sun Pirates during Jinbei's captaincy, and is now assumedly the captain himself. But that's it. That's all I got for you. Out of over 1,000 characters in 27 years of fictional pirate storytelling, there are only 8 first mates and or vice captains. And I think a big reason for this is that very early on, Oda accidentally broke the pirate mold with his awkward Zoro situation, and it made him realizes that each pirate crew operates differently according to the values of their captain. This can be seen most prominently with the 4 emperors. Whitebeard doesn't have a first mate because the goal of his crew is to have and nurture a family. Whitebeard was a father who loved all of his sons equally, with the responsibility of a first mate being divided over his 16 division commanders. And Marco might be the first division commander, and he did inherit captaincy after Whitebeard's death, but the division numbers themselves do not dictate hierarchy. There's also no functional difference between the 1st division and the 16th division. They were all loved equally by Daddy Whitebeard. For a more dysfunctional family dynamic, you have the Big Mom Pirates, who also follow a non-traditional structure with the Sweet Commander system, which designated vice captain responsibility between 4 individuals. However, it also gets a bit complicated because the Big Mom Pirates follow a family hierarchy as well. We've mentioned him before in this video, but although he wasn't a Sweet Commander, Charlotte Perospero, the firstborn, held more authority than Katakuri. The Charlotte family were a bit of a big mess. There was no clearly defined second in command. It really was just a system designed to placate their mother as best they could. Then with Kaido, you've got the Beast Pirates, who value only strength, but again divide the first mate role across 3 calamities. Blackbeard then has his 10 Titanic captains. Crossguild has probably the most, how shall we say, unique command structure in modern piracy. Doflamingo had his 4 cardsuit officers, and so on and so forth. The whole idea of having a first mate almost seems like an outdated relic of an idea in One Piece, which is why we only tend to encounter them in the old days of Roger and Silver's Rayleigh. In the modern day, we've evolved beyond that, and that is seen most clearly within the Straw Hats themselves. The Straw Hats are a crew focused on dreams and adventure, and so Luffy doesn't refer to people by their traditional roles aboard a pirate vessel, but instead by their ambitions. And a lot of the time these do cross over. Like Frankie's dream of wanting to build a ship that can sail around the world, it makes sense to call him the shipwright. But there are some where it doesn't make sense, and Zoro is one of them. His dream is to become the world's greatest swordsman. So to Luffy, he doesn't see Zoro as a first mate, he sees Zoro as a swordsman, which is incredibly respectful. He doesn't try to force Zoro into a traditional pirate structure. Instead, he sees Zoro's dream and actively supports it, creating a new role, as he does with each and every other crew member. When it comes to the issue of trust, I often say this with Luffy, but you either have it or you don't. There are no levels of trust. And so there's not really any need to designate a second in command either, because each Straw Hat has their moments where they fulfill that role. And as much as you can definitely say that Zoro often becomes the default second in command, there are so many situations where that role falls to Sanji. In fact, I think if you went through and tallied all the moments where they each take on that position, they'd probably be about equal. But each Straw Hat has at some point taken on that second in command position. And that is why this crew is particularly unbeatable. The Straw Hats are extremely modular and can function perfectly in any configuration, to the point where there's no need for a traditional hierarchy aside from the captain. Because putting people in cleanly defined boxes like first mate or vice captain is the antithesis of freedom. Luffy would never do such a thing, which is why Zoro has never been the first mate and will simply always be the swordsman of the Straw Hat Pirates. Here are some of the most hilariously poorly aged theories in One Piece. Meadows is Kaido. Even as late into the series as Dressrosa, the only image we'd seen of Kaido was his Water 7 silhouette, which is to say that no one really expected Kaido to turn out to be quite the Chad he did. But as the Dressrosa arc ramped up, it was revealed that the Blackbeard pirates had a presence on the island. Also, the Big Mom pirates were sailing outside of it, and so it was speculated that Kaido would be here as well, and it would turn into an Emperor Battle Royale. Particularly since Kaido was the most connected Emperor to Doflamingo, it just made sense. And so here's everything we knew about Kaido at the time. 1, he was big. 2, he was wacky looking. And 3, he had a bit of a thing for animals. All criteria which perfectly fit Meadows. If you don't remember, Meadows was a gladiator in Block D, who unlike every other contestant, mysteriously disappeared after losing. And so it was thought that Meadows, nay Kaido's, was off screen implementing some sort of super secret emperor business. He'd lost on purpose, for reasons, and he was going to ultimately emerge as the big bad guy of Dressrosa. That was up until Meadows, in all of his mediocrity, was finally spotted again in chapter 786, and 9 chapters later, the real Kaido would be introduced, thus putting an end to Meadows' short-lived reign of relevance. Although I do genuinely crave to see a reality where Meadows did turn out to be Kaido. Everyone is Sabo. So after Luffy's post-war flashback, and after having his death confirmed in Databook Green, and also Oda had recently killed off Ace, all of those things kept in mind didn't really matter, because nobody actually believed that Sabo was dead. However, that presents a problem, because if he's alive, where, or more funly to speculate, who is he? So fans immediately set about giving Eiichiro Oda far too much credit for foreshadowing, and speculating on who could it be, landing on the illustrious Lawbo theory. The idea was that Sabo took on a new identity as Trafalgar Law, and that's why he saved Luffy at Marineford. This is despite the fact that we'd already seen Law drawn as a child, and that child, very notably, was not Sabo. Still, it was a lot better than the other Sabo theories. One stated that Sabo was Gladius because they both wear a top hat, and a few audacious fans even proposed that Doflamingo was actually Sabo, and that Dressrosa would be a tragic punch-filled reunion. This was despite the fact that we'd already seen Doflamingo drawn as a child, and that child, very notably, was not Sabo. And surprisingly few people vocalized the opinion that, hey, maybe we just haven't seen him yet. The death of Zoro. Alright, this may be one of the most amazingly stupid things that the One Piece fanbase has ever done, perhaps ever will do. But at the height of theory crafting, people were getting very desperate to connect every dot possible. And so 2 chapters before Meadows would return to the series, Oda drew what was considered to be a bombshell color spread. Behold, Picnic with Zombies. Quite a delightful picture actually. It's legitimately one one of my favorite color spreads. But this picnic allegedly contains a hidden message. One of the gravestones in this image contains the number 944, and due to the whole theme of death in this image, people took this as a sign that a character was going to die in chapter 944. And just whose unfortunate buttocks are firmly affixed to that gravestone? Well, that's right, it's Zoro, who also has a death flag on his back. Quite literally, there's a skull and crossbones, which means bad, very bad. And so it could not be more clear. Zoro was going to die in chapter 944. This was something that Oda had locked in and planned in retrospect more than half a decade in advance. And I'm not joking here, I wish I was. But certain people took this very seriously. And so when the moment finally came 5 to 6 years later, just picture this. Chapter 943. Zoro has just brazenly leapt into combat to protect Toko. A fight against Kyoshiro and all of Orochi's overwhelming forces is imminent. So faced with the full force of Wano, is this the end for our Zoro? The answer is no, never. Why was this a thing? To be fair, there was no death, but there was a killer. Chapter 944 is the one where Kamazo was revealed to be killer. Not that you had a lot of opportunity to appreciate that over all of the whinging that the Zoro death theory didn't come true. Big Mom is Nami's mother, so I would say that about a third of all One Piece theories revolve around parents. This fan base has this like hyper fixation on blood relatives, despite a key theme of One Piece being found family and the irrelevance of bloodlines. But since we don't know who Nami's biological mother is, it has to be someone, and that someone is obviously Big Mom. And the evidence for this is as follows. 1. Nami must have a biological mother. 2. Big Mom is the only relevant female character of age that we know. 3. Pink and orange hair are, they're kind of similar. We're going to say kind of similar. 4. Nami is greedy and Big Mom is also greedy. And finally, it was, quote, foreshadowed by Nami's bond with Lola, her sister on Thriller Bark. And so Nami was given Big Mom's Vivia card so that she could take it into an epic big arc where she would face off against her evil mother. And you know, it kind of turned out to be true. Except instead of Nami, it was Sanji. Instead of Big Mom, it was Judge. Instead of a Vivia card, it was a wedding invitation. Instead of facing off, it was an awkward alliance. And instead of anything that the theory said would happen happening, completely different things happened. Other than that, though, the theory is completely sound. Vinsmoke everyone. So after Sanji was revealed to have royal lineage and more importantly siblings, Vinsmoke connections started happening everywhere. And again, seriously, about a third of all theories in this fandom are just this character is secretly related to that character. So fans introduced us to the idea of Vinsmoke Killer, who was obviously a Vinsmoke because he has blonde hair, and Oda gave him a mask to hide the trademark eyebrows. That was the best of what they came up with. We also had Vinsmoke Bellamy because he has blonde hair, and also Saint Shepherd, because again, he has blonde hair. In fact, before Vinsmoke Judge appeared, there had even been a long-standing theory that Saint Shepherd was Sanji's father. But as ridiculous as family theories are, they have nothing on this next one. Kaido is a Poneglyph. Alright, let me explain. This was one I was actually a big fan of back in the day because I just love how ridiculous it was. But the idea is that poneglyphs were indestructible objects, and Kaido was an unkillable creature. You put 2 and 2 together, feed the poneglyph a devil fruit, and then bam, there is your Kaido glyph right there. This was quote-unquote logical because we knew that Kaido had a connection to Punk Hazard. And we knew that the previous tenant of Punk Hazard, Dr. Vegapunk, had innovated the method of feeding fruits to objects. Therefore, Kaido could have been an experiment gone wrong. This was before he was revealed to have dragon powers, by the way, so it's a stupid theory, but I still kinda love it. Sea Stone Sandals. Along the same lines, fans were faced with quite the predicament when Silver's Rayleigh managed to block Admiral Kizaru on Sabati. So at this point, we kind of knew that a thing like Haki existed, but mostly in the form of what would go on to be known as Conqueror's Haki. So in an effort to explain Rayleigh's powers, fans theorized that the bottom of his sandals were lined with sea stone, much like how Smoker's weapon is tipped with sea stone. And honestly, in world, not a terrible idea. If I'm a pirate or a marine, then having some shoes or gloves with a dab of sea stone to hard count those pesky fruit users, that sounds like a good idea. But this next idea is bad. Not content with sea stone as an explanation, many people also suggested that Rayleigh had mirrors under his sandals that reflected Kizaru's light, essentially using the Luffy method of defeating Foxy. And it's one of those situations where it's like, no, you had a good idea the first time. Why did we have to go to mirrors? It's so specific reckon it would only work against one person. Or against two people, Kizaru and Foxy. Green Bull is Zoro's father. Alright, this one's a bit tricky, and I'd like to introduce you now to the concept of a compound theory, which means that for this idea to work, it relies on another unproven theory also being true. So already, we're in pretty bad territory here, because we're speculating based on speculation. But that theory was that Zoro's father was Ushimaru. Not at all unreasonable given their resemblance, but from here it was speculated that Ushimaru was Green Bull, because Green Bull didn't need to eat, and that raised a parallel with the samurai who also didn't need to eat. Also, Zoro has green hair, and Green Bull has green in his name. And with that in mind, I don't even think we really need the other evidence. What the Green Bull theorists failed to take into consideration was photosynthesis. Green Bull is a plant man, and therefore he feeds off the nurturing teat of sunlight. Again, so many theories are just about making two unrelated people related. And off the top of my head, it's really difficult to think of a time when any of them have been proven correct. The only one I can think of is when people assumed that Lola was related to Big Mom. That was a pretty big dub, but everything else is a not that. Straw Hat Paulie. So at the beginning of Water 7, it was clear that we were getting a new crewmate. Specifically, we were getting a shipwright. And whilst we were introduced to a veritable buffet of shipsmiths, our options pretty quickly narrowed down when the two major ones turned out to be traitors, and another one was pretty firmly planted as a villain. I mean, what Frankie did in the beginning is still pretty hard to forgive. At the very least, Robin was much more vague with her misdoings. Like, she never harmed the Straw Hats directly, which meant that our options were pretty much reduced to Paulie. Prior to any slobby, he was the major contender. But from there, it quickly became clear that Frankie was our guy. Marco's message. This is a weird one because it's hard to blame people speculating over this. But in chapter 909, Marco's dialogue made it sound like he had declined the invitation to fight Kaido on Wano. And in his place, he gave Nekomamushi a message for Luffy. A message? What could it be about? Could it be something about Ace? Is it something to do with the final road Poneglyph? Could it be a secret weakness of Kaido's that Whitebeard learned during his time with him on the Rocks Pirates? Or perhaps even some information about Blackbeard. Marco knows things about Blackbeard, things that he still has not told Luffy. But nope, it was none of that. The message effectively amounted to, yeah, sure, I'll fight the Kaido with you, but I'm gonna be a little bit late. And also, the message was never delivered to Luffy. In fact, this message, for all intents and purposes, may as well never have existed. Because in the grand scheme of storytelling, it is completely meaningless. It was something inserted for the purpose of making us think about what it could be. Blood Logia. Ever since the three admirals were named on Long Ring Longland, people had tried to predict their devil fruits using the Kuzan model, which was a Logia and an element relevant to the epithet color. And actually, Kizaru was the one who was most difficult in this regard. Lightning had already been taken, not a lot of people were thinking about light, and as for other yellow substances, well, everything just kept coming back to urine. But for Akainu, the red dog, there were only really two key ideas. One of which was lava/magma, which ended up being correct, but the other was that he would be a blood Logia, something to really reflect his sinister nature that we would go on to see in the Ohara flashback. I'd still be very keen to see a blood Logia, although it might risk being a bit too close to an actual water fruit. The raid will fail. So this is a big one. In fact, it might be the best known theory in the entire One Piece community. Early on in Wano, we learned that there was a plan to raid Onigashima, and so a theory emerged that the Alliance would fail in this endeavor and have to repeat and regroup for a second battle to ultimately bring down Kaido as well as Big Mom. It was a legitimately intriguing idea in the beginning, but to say that people got carried away with the idea would be a colossal understatement. When the raid did finally get underway and the standard shonen thing inevitably occurred, where the bad guys were being beaten one by the good guys, the intensity behind the raid failing only grew. People refused to look at what was actually happening in front of them because by this point they'd invested like 2 to 3 years of their lives into this idea. So everything was seen as a red herring. They're winning. That means that they're about to lose. This is a red herring. That's what kept happening right up until the end. And in fact, the theory wasn't finally put into a grave until Wano itself ended. And to this day, people will still defend it as a sound idea, even in the 11th hour. But I personally think it's quite the cautionary tale of getting so carried away in theory crafting to the point where you start trying to write the story yourself, and then being disappointed that the story you wrote didn't happen. Still, even with that, this theory is not as bad as Zoro kills Kaido. At the very least, the raid failing was an interesting idea in the beginning and quite well argued. Zoro kills Kaido, however, was utter madness. The idea here is purely based on Zoro and Ryuma, the latter of which was the protagonist of Oda's one-shot monsters, which is actually canon in the One Piece world. But this theory invokes a very dangerous word known as parallels. And the idea is that because Zoro had parallels to Ryuma, that meant that he was destined to replicate Ryuma exactly 1-to-1. And in Monsters, Ryuma killed a dragon. So obviously in One Piece, Piece, Zoro is going to kill Kaido, another dragon. In all fairness, that wasn't all there was to the idea. Kaido himself had a very clear philosophy on death, and it did look like everything was building to his removal from the world, which is unusual for One Piece villains. And also that Wano was kind of built up as a Zoro arc, sort of like how Whole Cake Island was a Sanji arc, kind of. But the vast majority of the idea banked on the parallels between Zoro and Ryuma. And things even got so wild that the Microsoft Store Twitter account even weighed in with what I think was a very sensible opinion. And the reason why parallels are so dangerous is because in a series this big, you can use them to prove literally anything. In fact, I even did a video where I jokingly highlighted that Luffy arguably has more parallels to Ryuma than Zoro does. Because Ryuma is an Oda prototype. Yeah, he looks like Zoro, but he acts like Luffy. And also, to be fair, in the end, Zoro did parallel Ryuma, as his finishing move against King was in the same style as the one Ryuma used on the dragon, which was a pretty cool detail. But the people who loudly supported this theory online were frankly insufferable. It is probably the worst idea that has ever been afflicted upon us, and it gives me great pleasure to say, well, that didn't age well.